Before sunrise, colonial America was almost entirely dark. There were no glowing skylines along the Atlantic coast, no electric lamps burning through the night, no engines humming beyond the walls. In a farmhouse outside Philadelphia, a woman stirred the embers beneath a blanket of ash and listened for the first crackle of returning flame. In a one-room cabin in the Carolina backcountry, children slept on pallets while their father felt for his boots in the cold. On a Virginia plantation, enslaved workers were already awake, moving through the darkness toward kitchens, barns, stables, and fields. In Boston, a watchman called the hour along streets still scarred by occupation and siege. Far to the west, beyond the settlements that appeared on British maps, hunters from indigenous nations crossed valleys their ancestors had known for generations. The year was 1776, but almost no one waking on that winter morning could yet know what the number would come to mean. The world they inhabited was not yet the United States. It was a long, uneven chain of British colonies pressed between the Atlantic Ocean and a continental interior that Europeans described as wilderness, though millions of indigenous people had shaped, travelled, farmed, hunted, burned, defended, and named that land for thousands of years. The 13 colonies shared a king, a distant imperial government, a coastline, and a growing dispute with Parliament. They did not share a single culture. A merchant in Newport, a German-speaking farmer in Pennsylvania, an enslaved rice worker near Charleston, a Scots-Irish settler in the Appalachian foothills, and a Mohawk diplomat in the Iroquois Confederacy occupied the same broad historical moment, but not the same America. About 2.5 million people lived in the 13 colonies, and roughly 1 in 5 was enslaved. Most people lived in rural communities, not in towns. The largest city, Philadelphia, held only around 40,000 residents, yet it seemed immense to visitors arriving through countryside broken by orchards, fences, mills, and church spires. New York, Boston, and Charleston were smaller still, but they concentrated wealth, rumour, disease, political agitation, imported luxury, and human misery. Beyond them stretched farms and plantations, separated by muddy roads, rivers, forests, marshes, and distances measured less by miles than by the time required to cross them. To modernise, maps of 1776 can make the colonies look settled and complete. They were neither. Borders overlapped, claims contradicted one another. Colonies disputed their own boundaries, while land companies sold territory they did not control. The British Crown had attempted to restrict settlement beyond the Appalachian Mountains after the 7 Years' War, partly to reduce costly conflict with indigenous nations. Settlers ignored the line. Speculators imagined fortunes on paper. Surveyors walked into contested valleys with chains and compasses, translating living homelands into grids, lots, and deeds. Every new mark on a map could represent profit to one family and dispossession to another. Even the word American carried uncertainty. For generations, colonists had thought of themselves as British subjects living in America. They drank toasts to the king, purchased British cloth and ceramics when they could afford them, followed news from London, and took pride in rights they believed belonged to Englishmen. Their protest did not begin as a unanimous demand for independence. It began as an argument over power. Who could tax, who could legislate, who could command obedience, and whether an empire separated by an ocean could govern people who had grown accustomed to managing much of their own affairs. That ocean was not an empty distance. It was the central road of the empire. Ships carried newspapers, weapons, tea, molasses, textiles, letters, soldiers, migrants, and captive human beings. A message could take weeks to cross the Atlantic, if storms or enemy cruisers did not delay it. Political reality arrived in packets. Decisions made in London reached America after the circumstances that inspired them had already changed. Colonial responses returned just as slowly. The empire argued with itself through a time lag, each side reacting to an earlier version of the other. On land, communication moved at the speed of muscle. A good rider could carry urgent news quickly over a reliable road, but most roads were not reliable. Rain turned them into troughs of mud. Winter froze ruts hard enough to break wheels. Bridges washed away. Travellers followed blazed trees, tavern directions, milestones and memory. Rivers often offered the fastest route, but currents, tides, ice and wind controlled the schedule. A journey that appears short on a modern map could consume a day and leave a horse exhausted. The postal system was improving. Benjamin Franklin, dismissed by the British from his imperial postal position, had become Postmaster General for the Continental Congress in 1775. Post riders linked towns and carried newspapers whose pages were read aloud in taverns, workshops, kitchens, military camps, and public squares. A single copy might pass through many hands until the paper softened and tore. News was communal. A man who could not read might still know the latest political argument because someone at the inn had stood beside the fire and performed it for the room. But information did not become truth simply because it was printed. Newspapers openly served political causes. Printers selected letters, rumours, battlefield reports, and essays according to their loyalties and survival needs. Victories were exaggerated. Defeats were softened or blamed on treachery. Atrocity stories circulated because fear recruited more effectively than moderation. Anonymous writers adopted classical names, presenting themselves as Brutus, Cato, or a humble farmer, while attacking neighbours everyone could identify. In small communities, public argument was personal. The man denounced in the newspaper might appear beside you at church on Sunday. The physical texture of daily life was equally intimate. Houses were not all picturesque clapboard buildings with white paint and perfect shutters. Along the coast and in established towns stood brick mansions, timber houses, stone farmsteads, crowded rented rooms, workshops with families sleeping above them, and decaying structures erected decades earlier. In the backcountry were log houses, but also frame and stone dwellings built according to regional traditions carried from England, Scotland, Ireland, Germany, the Netherlands, Africa, and elsewhere. Some poor families lived in houses with dirt floors and smoke-blackened rafters. Others owned land, livestock, furniture, tools, and enough household goods to make survival less precarious. Inequality could be seen from the road. A wealthy room displayed polish and permanence. Walnut chairs stood against plastered walls. A looking-glass reflected candlelight. Imported porcelain announced connections to the Atlantic economy. Bed curtains provided warmth, privacy, and status. Silver spoons, portraits, clocks, and books were not merely useful objects. They were declarations that the household possessed money, refinement, credit, and a place in the social order. In a poorer home, stools replaced chairs, wooden trenchers replaced ceramics, and a chest might hold nearly everything the family wished to protect. A bedstead was valuable, blankets were valuable, iron cookware was valuable. When armies later entered houses and took food, cloth, animals, or tools, they did not remove disposable possessions. They stripped away a family's margin between endurance and disaster. The day began with fire because nearly every necessity depended on it. Fire heated rooms, boiled water, cooked food, dried clothing, softened wax, heated irons, and supplied light. It also killed. Sparks caught in wooden roofs, chimneys accumulated soot, open hearths exposed skirts and children's hands to flame. Towns feared fire as a collective catastrophe, and householders were expected to keep buckets ready. When bells rang at night, residents ran into the street carrying leather buckets, hooks, ladders, and whatever courage panic allowed. Light was precious. Tallow candles smelled, smoked, and melted quickly. Beeswax candles burned more cleanly, but cost more. Whale oil lamps appeared in homes connected to maritime trade. Pine knots and rushlights offered cheaper illumination. Most people organised work around daylight and used evening light carefully. A room lit for a modern historical drama would have seemed wastefully bright. In reality, faces emerged and disappeared at the edge of a small flame. Reading strained the eyes. Sewing required concentration. Corners remained shadowed. Night was not a decorative mood, it was a practical boundary. Time itself felt different. Church bells, sunrise, meals, tides, and familiar routines mattered more than a minute hand to many people. Wealthy households and public buildings might own clocks. Others relied on sundials, pocket watches, or estimation. Local time followed the sun. No national time zones synchronized the continent. An appointment could be described by morning, afternoon, or the hour, but travel and labor remained vulnerable to weather, animals, and human delay. Precision existed, especially in navigation, commerce, and scientific work. Yet ordinary life accepted irregularity because it had no choice. Water came from wells, springs, pumps, cisterns, and streams. The popular image of colonists drinking alcohol because water was always unsafe is too simple. People drank water, judged its taste and source, and understood that foul water could make them ill, even if they did not know about microbes. They also drank cider, beer, rum, milk, tea, coffee, chocolate, and mixtures whose strength varied widely. Fermented drinks stored better in some circumstances and supplied calories, but access depended on region, season, class, age, and household custom. A labourer might begin the day with cider. A child might drink small beer. A fashionable family might perform gentility around a tea table while discussing resistance to the empire that had delivered the tea. Tea had become politically dangerous long before independence. Boycotts turned consumption into a public test of loyalty. Merchants who imported forbidden goods risked shaming, intimidation, or violence. Women who purchased and prepared many household goods but held little formal political power found their choices politicized. A cup placed on a table could suggest submission to Parliament. Homespun cloth could become a patriotic symbol. Yet principles competed with comfort. Smuggling continued. Imported goods remained desirable. A colonist might denounce British tyranny in public and privately hope that a ship had brought the fabric, tools, or medicine his family wanted. Breakfast was not a standardized meal. It might include porridge, bread, leftovers, fried meat, corn cakes, milk, or nothing substantial at all. Diet followed geography. New England families relied on corn, beans, rye, fish, pork, dairy products, and seasonal produce. The middle colonies produced abundant wheat and were sometimes called the bread colonies. In the Chesapeake, corn and pork sustained many households, while tobacco dominated export agriculture. In South Carolina and Georgia, rice and indigo generated fortunes through enslaved labor. Coastal communities ate oysters, shad, cod, clams, crabs, and other foods that could seem luxurious today, but were ordinary when locally abundant. Food also revealed power. The polished table of a planter concealed the work behind every dish: planting, slaughtering, preserving, grinding, hauling, cooking, washing, and serving. In wealthy southern households, enslaved cooks transformed local and imported ingredients into elaborate meals, often drawing on African, European, and Indigenous knowledge. Their skill could enhance an owner's reputation, while their own names disappeared from guest accounts. The dining room celebrated hospitality. The kitchen exposed coercion. Nothing in 1776 was casually thrown away if it retained use. Bones entered broth. Grease became soap or candles. Cloth was patched, cut down for children, turned into rags, and finally used as raw material for paper. Metal objects were repaired. Broken ceramics might be kept, repurposed, or riveted. Barrels became containers, furniture, or building material. The economy of reuse was not an environmental philosophy. It was the logic of scarcity and labour. An object represented hours of human effort, expensive transport, or cash that might not be available again. Cash itself was a problem. British coins circulated alongside Spanish dollars, Portuguese coins, colonial paper notes, private credit, barter, and account book promises. The Spanish milled dollar, divided into 8 reales, helped produce the familiar phrase, pieces of 8. A transaction might be calculated in pounds, shillings, and pence, without involving British coins at all. Values differed by colony. Merchants understood conversion tables that confused outsiders. Rural neighbours extended credit because coins were scarce, recording debts that might be settled through produce, labour, or a chain of obligations linking many households. In 1775, the Continental Congress began issuing paper currency to finance war. The notes carried intricate designs and warnings against counterfeiting, but they were promises backed by a political union whose future was uncertain. People accepted them because armies needed supplies, and because revolution required belief made tangible. Yet paper multiplied as the conflict continued, and confidence weakened. The phrase, "not worth a continental," would belong more fully to later years, but the danger was already present in 1776. Every note passed from hand to hand carried a silent question. Who would still honour this when the war was over? For most families, wealth was rooted in land, labour, and relationships. Land ownership could support political participation, social independence, and inheritance, but possession was never as universal as later mythology suggested. Tenants worked estates in New York's Hudson Valley. Renters crowded cities. Indentured servants exchanged years of labour for passage or opportunity. Sailors owned little they could not carry. Enslaved people were legally treated as property, while creating enormous wealth for others. Colonial America spoke passionately about independence, while depending on many forms of dependence. The household was the basic unit of production. A farm was not simply a residence surrounded by scenery. It was a workshop whose members planted, weeded, harvested, milked, slaughtered, spun, wove, mended, preserved, brewed, traded, and cared for animals. Gender shaped expectations, but necessity blurred boundaries. Men performed much heavy field labour, managed legal transactions, and represented households publicly. Women cooked, laundered, produced textiles, tended gardens and poultry, preserved food, delivered and raised children, nursed the sick, and often worked in fields, shops, taverns, and family businesses. Widows might manage property and accounts more visibly, though their freedom often arrived through loss. Laundry alone demanded strength and time. Water had to be carried, soap had to be made or purchased, clothes were soaked, boiled, beaten, scrubbed, rinsed, wrung, and dried. In winter, hands cracked in cold water. In summer, heat from the fire filled the work area. The clean linen admired on a gentleman's body was the final surface of labour he might scarcely notice. Domestic work vanished precisely when it succeeded. Clothing carried equally hidden stories. Linen began in flax fields, where plants were pulled, dried, retted, broken, scutched, hackled, spun, woven, bleached, cut, and sewn. Wool required sheep, shearing, cleaning, carding, spinning, dyeing, weaving, and fulling. Imported cloth passed through networks of merchants, ships, warehouses, and credit. Homespun became a revolutionary emblem, but producing enough fabric for a family remained slow. Clothing was therefore altered rather than discarded. Adult garments became children's garments. A fine coat could outlive its first owner. Buttons were removed before worn cloth became rags. Appearance mattered because strangers read status from the body. Fabric, colour, cleanliness, buckles, hats, wigs, and posture conveyed occupation and rank. Not every man wore a powdered wig, and not every woman dressed in the rigid elegance seen in elite portraits. Most people dressed for work in practical layers marked by wear. Enslaved labourers might receive coarse textiles as rations, and then reshape or supplement them to claim comfort, identity, beauty, and control over presentation. Clothing could be imposed, traded, stolen, inherited, purchased, or made. Even under bondage, the act of tying a head wrap or choosing a small ornament could preserve a private language of self. Children entered this world of labour early. Childhood existed, and parents expressed tenderness, grief, worry, and delight. But children were expected to become useful much sooner than modern families might imagine. A young child gathered wood, watched siblings, scared birds from crops, carried messages, wound yarn, or helped feed animals. Apprentices left home to learn trades under masters who assumed both authority and responsibility. Enslaved children faced work as a condition of ownership, and the approach of adolescence could bring sale, separation, or more punishing labour. Play survived everywhere, but it survived between demands. Birth was common, dangerous, and intensely local. Women usually gave birth surrounded by other women, with a midwife guiding the process. Physicians attended some elite families and increasingly claimed authority over childbirth, but the experienced female midwife remained central in many communities. There were no antiseptic rooms, blood transfusions, or reliable methods to stop severe infection and hemorrhage. A successful delivery could turn into fever days later. An infant might die before receiving a name in a family Bible. Parents had many children, partly because death visited so many homes, but repeated loss never made grief ordinary. The dead remained close to the living. Churchyards stood near meeting houses. Family plots lay beside farms. Mourning, rings, gloves, sermons, letters, and household rituals gave shape to absence. Wealth determined the coffin, procession, and stone, but not the ache. Epidemics could overwhelm customary ceremony, transforming individual tragedy into lists. In an age before photography, a lock of hair, a name in a Bible, or a small object might become the only physical trace of a child who had occupied an entire emotional world. This was the America entering 1776. Young but already burdened by memory, prosperous in places but harsh almost everywhere, politically bold yet structured by hierarchy, filled with people demanding rights while denying them to others. The revolution would not descend upon a silent landscape. It would pass through kitchens, wharves, fields, workshops, native towns, slave quarters, meeting houses, and crowded rented rooms. It would force people who had never spoken in congresses to decide what they would hide, surrender, carry, defend, and believe. In the ports, the revolution first appeared not as a clean line between two nations, but as a disruption of movement. Wharves that had once received British manufactures now watched for warships. Sailors listened for news of privateers and blockades. Merchants opened warehouses filled with goods they might not be able to replace. Ship carpenters, rope makers, sail makers, coopers, stevedores, fishmongers, cartmen, clerks, and customs officials all depended on trade, even when they cursed the regulations surrounding it. When commerce stopped, patriotism did not feed their families. Philadelphia offered the most impressive urban stage in America. Ships crowded the Delaware waterfront. Carts groaned over unpaved or uneven streets. Market stalls displayed meat, vegetables, bread, fish, butter, live poultry, imported goods, and second-hand objects. The brick fronts of prosperous houses stood near alleys where labourers rented cramped quarters. Church towers rose above rooftops, and the unfinished State House steeple was still absent from the building later known as Independence Hall. The city was large enough to feel anonymous, and small enough for reputation to travel quickly. It was also one of the most diverse cities in the British Atlantic. English Quakers lived beside Germans, Scots, Irish migrants, free and enslaved black residents, Jews, sailors from distant ports, and visitors speaking languages unfamiliar to local ears. Religious toleration had helped shape Pennsylvania, though tolerance did not erase prejudice or power. A stranger could enter a tavern and hear arguments about theology, currency, military enlistment, grain prices, and independence before the first mug was empty. Taverns were not simply places for drunken entertainment. They were communication centres, dining rooms, lodging houses, business offices, postal stops, auction spaces, courtrooms, and political theatres. A tavern keeper had access to news and influence because travellers brought both. Privacy was limited. Guests shared rooms and sometimes beds. Horses needed care. Meals arrived according to what the kitchen possessed, not a printed menu of personal choices. A traveller carrying important letters might sleep a few feet from someone whose loyalty he could not trust. In Boston, geography intensified politics. The town occupied a peninsula joined to the mainland by a narrow neck. Its crooked streets and dense waterfront neighbourhoods had endured years of confrontation. Customs seizures, troops quartered among civilians, the killing remembered as the Boston Massacre, the destruction of tea, punitive imperial laws, and finally, siege. By early 1776, British forces and Loyalist civilians remained trapped in the town while George Washington's army watched from surrounding heights. The siege was a test of patience, disease, supply, and nerve. Washington had inherited a collection of provincial forces and attempted to turn them into a continental army. Men came and went as enlistments expired. Gunpowder was dangerously scarce. Officers argued over rank. Camps required food, clothing, sanitation, discipline, and constant negotiation with nearby civilians. The heroic image of a general studying maps conceals the administrative struggle beneath command. An army could collapse without losing a battle if its men went unpaid, its bread failed to arrive, or sickness spread through its tents. During the winter, artillery captured at Fort Ticonderoga travelled toward Boston under the direction of Henry Knox. The guns crossed frozen rivers and difficult roads on sledges pulled by oxen and horses. Their arrival allowed Washington to fortify Dorchester Heights in March. The British commander, William Howe, faced cannon overlooking the town and harbour. A planned assault was delayed, and evacuation became the practical choice. On March 17th, British troops sailed away with more than 1,000 Loyalist civilians, many bound for Halifax. To patriots, the evacuation looked like divine favour and military triumph. To the families leaving Boston, it was exile. They abandoned shops, houses, friendships, possessions, and familiar graves, without knowing whether they would return. Some had supported the crown from conviction, others feared patriot retaliation or depended on imperial employment. Loyalism was not a single personality defect. It could grow from family ties, religion, commerce, cultural identity, fear of mob rule, distrust of Congress, or a sincere belief that reform within the empire was safer than rebellion. Those who remained entered homes vacated by friends and enemies. Furniture had been removed or damaged. Buildings had been used for military purposes. Fuel shortages had encouraged the dismantling of wooden structures. The town smelled of occupation, horses, waste, smoke, and illness. Soon, smallpox demanded attention. The return of patriot control did not restore ordinary life with the raising of a flag. War left rooms to clean, accounts to settle, suspected collaborators to judge, and bodies vulnerable to disease. New York faced its own transformation. It was a commercial port with Dutch roots, British institutions, enslaved labour, wealthy merchant families, artisan neighbourhoods, and deep political divisions. Its harbour made it strategically irresistible. Washington understood that the British would likely attack it after leaving Boston. Fortifications rose, soldiers arrived, civilians fled. Buildings became barracks and hospitals. Fields were cut by trenches. A city built for trade became a military position before the battle even began. Charleston, farther south, displayed another version of colonial wealth. Its merchants exported rice, indigo, deerskins, and other commodities through an Atlantic system tied to slavery. Elegant houses, gardens, imported furniture, and formal entertainments rested upon labour extracted from enslaved people in the city and surrounding low country. Black residents could outnumber white residents across much of the region, creating both wealth and constant fear among slaveholders. Laws controlled movement, assembly, trade, clothing, and punishment, because domination required daily enforcement. Rice cultivation was especially brutal. Enslaved workers cleared swamps, built embankments, controlled water, planted, weeded, harvested, threshed, and processed grain in environments alive with insects and disease. Knowledge brought from West Africa contributed to the success of rice culture, though planters claimed the profits and historical credit. The task system used on many low-country plantations assigned a measured amount of work, sometimes allowing workers to cultivate personal plots or sell goods after completion. That limited space did not make slavery humane. It showed how enslaved people fought to create time and community inside a regime designed to own them. Cities contained slavery too. Enslaved men worked as dock labourers, coachmen, sailors, craftsmen, and household servants. Enslaved women cooked, washed, cleaned, sold goods, cared for children, and performed exhausting domestic labour. They moved through streets carrying messages and commodities, sometimes hiring out and handling money while remaining legally owned. Urban movement could create opportunities to exchange news, maintain relationships, plan escape, or negotiate conditions. It also exposed people to patrols, advertisements for runaways, jailers, and sale. Runaway notices reveal lives through the hostile eyes of enslavers. They describe scars, skills, clothing, speech, family ties, literacy, and suspected destinations because owners wanted human property returned. Read against their purpose, the notices show determination. A person fled wearing the best garments available, perhaps carrying forged papers or passing as free. Some headed toward a spouse or parent. Some sought towns, ships, native communities, military lines or terrain where pursuit became difficult. Escape was not a symbol. It was a physical gamble against hunger, weather, betrayal, dogs, armed capture, and severe punishment. Northern colonies often hid slavery behind smaller numbers. Enslaved people lived and worked in New York, New Jersey, New England, and Pennsylvania. Merchants financed voyages connected to the slave economy. Distilleries processed molasses produced by enslaved labour. Shipyards built vessels for Atlantic commerce. Households displayed sugar, mahogany, dyes, and other goods whose paths led back to coercion. A town could congratulate itself on liberty while benefiting from bondage beyond the horizon or within the next room. Artisans occupied an important but uncertain middle position. Blacksmiths, printers, shoemakers, tailors, cabinet makers, silversmiths, wheelwrights, coopers, weavers, and carpenters sold skill as well as objects. Their shops opened onto streets so work could be seen and customers could enter. A craftsman's household might include a wife managing sales and accounts, children performing errands, apprentices learning through labour, journeymen earning wages, and perhaps enslaved or indentured workers. The shop was economic unit, school, family space, and hierarchy under one roof. An apprenticeship could offer training and a future trade, but it also placed a young person under another adult's control for years. Contracts regulated obedience, instruction, food, clothing, and moral conduct. Masters complained of apprentices who ran away, drank, gambled, or neglected work. Apprentices complained through flight, theft, resistance, or court petitions when masters abused them or failed to teach the promised craft. The ideal was paternal order. The reality depended on character, markets, illness, and power. Printers stood at the centre of revolutionary culture. A print shop was loud, physical, and dirty. Type had to be arranged by hand, letter after letter, in reverse. Ink stained fingers and clothing. Paper was expensive. Presses required force. Mistakes could survive into hundreds of copies. Printers balanced ideology against business, because offending the wrong faction might destroy a shop. A newspaper carried political essays beside shipping notices, runaway advertisements, goods for sale, poems, medical claims, and announcements of lost horses. Liberty and human sale appeared in neighbouring columns. On January 10, 1776, a pamphlet called Common Sense appeared in Philadelphia. Its author, Thomas Paine, had arrived from England only a little over a year earlier. He wrote with a directness that made inherited authority sound absurd. An island should not rule a continent. Monarchy was not sacred. Reconciliation had become dangerous. The pamphlet did not invent the desire for independence, but it gave scattered anger a sharp, portable language. Common Sense spread rapidly through printings and reprintings. Copies were sold, shared, and read aloud. Its success is sometimes presented as if an entire population changed its mind at once. In reality, readers argued. Some found Paine exhilarating. Others considered him reckless, irreligious, or socially dangerous. John Adams favoured independence but distrusted Paine's democratic political ideas. Loyalist writers answered in print. The pamphlet's importance lies partly in the fact that it made a previously radical conclusion discussable at ordinary tables. Political discussion depended on literacy, but literacy was not evenly distributed. New England's Protestant emphasis on Bible reading encouraged schooling and high literacy among many white men, and substantial, though lower levels among white women. Conditions differed elsewhere. Schooling could be seasonal, private, church-supported, or nearly absent. Children learned from primers, catechisms, copybooks, tutors, academies, and family members. Enslaved and free black education varied by place and circumstance. Some learned to read despite hostility or prohibition, recognizing that literacy could open access to scripture, employment, correspondence, forged passes, and political thought. Books were valuable and unevenly available. A prosperous library might include classical authors, histories, sermons, legal works, science, travel accounts, and novels. A modest household might own only a Bible, almanac, and a few devotional texts. Almanacs were practical companions, offering calendars, weather predictions, astronomical data, jokes, moral sayings, and advice. They helped people calculate planting, travel, court dates, and the movement of the moon, though their forecasts were no more immune to disappointment than modern ones. Religion shaped time, language, community, and politics. Congregational meeting houses dominated many New England towns. Anglicans worshipped through the established church in parts of the South and New York. Quakers gathered in disciplined silence. Presbyterians, Baptists, Lutherans, German Reformed congregations, Dutch Reformed communities, Catholics, Jews, Moravians, and others occupied an increasingly plural landscape. The Great Awakening of earlier decades had taught many colonists to value emotional conversion and question established authority, yet religious commitment did not automatically lead to revolution. Clergy and congregations divided like everyone else. Sunday could mean rest from ordinary labour, but only within limits. Animals still required care. Meals still required preparation. Enslaved servants still worked. Laws in some places punished travel, trade, entertainment, or failure to attend worship. The meeting house served as sacred space and civic gathering place. Seating reflected rank. Sermons could last long enough for discomfort to become part of devotion. In unheated buildings during winter, worshippers brought foot warmers or endured the cold beneath layers of clothing. Revolutionary rhetoric borrowed the language of providence. Patriots saw deliverance from Boston as evidence that heaven favoured their cause. Loyalists prayed for order and condemned rebellion as sin. Fast days and days of Thanksgiving interpreted military events through collective worship. The same Bible could support obedience to authority, resistance to tyranny, spiritual equality, or the defense of slavery, depending on the reader. Faith did not resolve political contradiction. It gave contradiction eternal stakes. Law entered ordinary life through county courts, local magistrates, sheriffs, constables, and customs more often than through grand constitutional theory. Courts recorded debts, wills, assaults, property disputes, apprenticeships, tavern licenses, theft, slander, and accusations of sexual misconduct. People sued neighbours with surprising frequency because credit and reputation held communities together. A damaged name could threaten marriage, business, and survival. Spoken insults mattered in a world where most agreements depended on personal trust. Punishment was public by design. Stocks and pillories exposed bodies to shame. Whipping inflicted pain before witnesses. Fines punished those who could pay, and debt could trap those who could not. Executions drew crowds because authority wanted the lesson seen. Jails generally held people awaiting trial, punishment, or payment, rather than serving as long-term penitentiaries. The modern prison system was still emerging. Conditions were unsanitary, and prisoners often depended on relatives or charity for food and bedding. The law treated married women through the doctrine of coverture, under which a wife's independent legal identity was severely restricted. Her husband generally controlled property and wages, though local practice, equity arrangements, widowhood, prenuptial agreements, and separate estates could complicate the rule. A woman might operate a shop, manage a farm, keep accounts, and make critical decisions, while lacking the legal independence her labour suggested. Political theory described household heads as independent citizens, assuming a supporting world of dependent wives, children, servants, and enslaved people. Voting was neither universal nor uniform. Requirements differed by colony and could involve property, wealth, religion, residence, race, sex, or tax-paying status. Many adult white men could not vote. Elections were public social events, often accompanied by food, drink, pressure, and personal negotiation. Secret ballots were not the universal norm. A voter might announce his choice where neighbours, employers, tenants, or patrons could observe it. Independence would transfer sovereignty without instantly creating democracy in the modern sense. Yet 1776 opened surprising cracks in the old structure. New Jersey's constitution, adopted on July 2nd, referred to all inhabitants who met a property requirement, language that later permitted some unmarried women and free black property holders to vote, before the state restricted suffrage to white men in 1807. The document did not produce equality, and practice was contested, but its wording revealed how revolutionary constitution making could create consequences lawmakers had not fully anticipated. Status still commanded deference. Gentlemen expected bows, titles, and recognition. Elite men cultivated controlled speech and movement to distinguish themselves from labourers. Public leadership favoured property, education, and family connection. At the same time, wartime mobilization gave ordinary white men weapons, committees, uniforms, and political leverage. A farmer who had once listened silently to a magistrate could now serve beside him, vote in a local meeting, or challenge his loyalty. The revolution disturbed hierarchy even when its leaders hoped to contain the disturbance. Committees of inspection and safety enforced resistance at the local level. They watched merchants, collected supplies, organized militia, examined travelers, circulated agreements, and judged suspicious behavior. To supporters, they embodied self-government. To opponents, they were unauthorized instruments of intimidation. A man who refused an association could be denounced in print. A shop could lose customers. A family could face threats. Feathers and tar, crowd violence, confiscation, and forced declarations transformed political conformity into a matter of bodily safety. The famous tar and feather punishment was horrifying, even when the tar used was not always boiling. Victims were stripped or partially stripped, coated, covered with feathers, paraded, mocked, and sometimes beaten. The objective was not only pain, it was destruction of dignity and social standing. Revolutionary crowds understood spectacle. They claimed to defend liberty through acts that could silence dissent by terror. This is one of the hidden truths of 1776. The movement against imperial coercion generated coercion of its own. Patriots could be principled, brave, and capable of sacrifice. They could also be vindictive. Loyalists could be thoughtful defenders of constitutional order. They could also guide British forces, inform on neighbours, or support violent suppression. Neutrality might reflect cowardice, wisdom, pacifism, divided family loyalty, or simple exhaustion. The labels conceal human motives as often as they reveal them. In countless communities, the revolution arrived as a question asked quietly at a door. Which side are you on? The answer might determine whether a neighbour extended credit, whether a committee permitted travel, whether soldiers entered the barn, whether a son enlisted, or whether a family packed what it could carry and fled. Before independence became a national memory, it became a local fracture. By the spring of 1776, reconciliation had become increasingly difficult to imagine. Blood had already been shed at Lexington, Concord, and Bunker Hill. The king had declared the colonies in rebellion. British authorities were recruiting forces for a larger war. American troops had invaded Canada and found that expectation was not the same as victory. Congress governed without admitting that it governed, raising an army, issuing money, appointing officials, negotiating abroad, and asking colonies for resources while still lacking a formal nation beneath its authority. The invasion of Canada exposed the limits of revolutionary optimism. American leaders had hoped French-speaking Canadians might join resistance to Britain. Instead,
The campaign became a brutal lesson in distance, weather, supply, and local mistrust. An assault on Quebec at the end of 1775 failed. Richard Montgomery was killed. Benedict Arnold was wounded. The surviving troops maintained a weak blockade through winter, living in poor conditions as disease spread. Smallpox was more dangerous than many weapons. It produced fever, pain, and pustules, killed a significant share of those infected, and could leave survivors scarred or blind. People understood that survivors usually gained immunity, and inoculation by deliberately introducing material from a smallpox sore could produce a controlled infection. But inoculated patients could spread the disease. The procedure carried real danger, and communities fought over when and where it should occur.
Fear of smallpox shaped movement and military decisions because an army gathered thousands of vulnerable bodies into ideal conditions for contagion. In Canada, smallpox moved through the American force and helped destroy the campaign. Men deserted or became too weak to fight. Medical care was overwhelmed. Retreat turned roads and boats into channels of suffering. The revolutionaries who had imagined liberation found themselves appearing as foreign occupiers to many Canadians, demanding supplies and bringing war. By June, the remaining American troops withdrew. The failed invasion reminded Congress that British power would not collapse simply because colonial arguments sounded persuasive in Philadelphia. Political momentum nevertheless accelerated. On April 12th, North Carolina's Provincial Congress adopted the Halifax Resolves, authorizing its delegates to support independence.
On May 15th, Virginia instructed its delegation to propose that the colonies be declared free and independent states. Other colonies revised instructions more cautiously, sometimes after intense local debate. Delegates did not arrive at a single revelation. They carried decisions produced in county meetings, provincial congresses, committees, private letters, angry streets, and months of military crisis. On May 10th, the Continental Congress recommended that colonies suppress authorities still exercising power under the Crown and establish governments based on the people. 5 days later, a preamble associated closely with John Adams declared that every form of authority under the Crown should be totally suppressed. This was revolution in administrative language. Royal governors had fled, dissolved assemblies, or lost practical control. New institutions did not rise in a vacuum. Clerks needed records, courts needed rules, taxes needed collection, militias needed command.
Independence was being assembled through paperwork before it was announced through ceremony. Inside the Pennsylvania State House, delegates worked through heat, uncertainty, and secrecy. The rooms, later polished by national memory, were working political spaces filled with ink, paper, dust, conversation, and fatigue. Windows could be opened for air at the cost of street noise and curious ears. Delegates lodged in boarding houses and taverns, dined together, exchanged private intelligence, and wrote letters that carried carefully chosen versions of events home. Congress was not a modern representative legislature elected under a single national system. Each colony selected delegates through its own revolutionary structures and gave them instructions of varying force. Delegations voted by colony, so the smallest and largest colonies formally carried the same weight on the central question. Personal brilliance mattered, but so did coalition, timing, and the willingness to wait until a declaration could appear united enough to survive. On June 7th, Richard Henry Lee of Virginia offered a resolution stating that the United Colonies were, and of right ought to be, free and independent states. The phrase would echo into the declaration, but Congress postponed the final vote while uncertain delegations sought new instructions. In the meantime, it appointed a committee to draft a public explanation. Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, Roger Sherman, and Robert R. Livingston. Jefferson wrote the initial draft in rented rooms on the second floor of a brick house at 7th and Market Streets. He was 33, already known for his elegant pen, and accompanied by an enslaved man named Robert Hemmings. That detail belongs in the room. The author preparing one of history's most famous statements of natural equality was being served by a person he legally owned.
The contradiction was not hidden from everyone in 1776. It was present in the architecture of the Revolution itself. Jefferson drew on Enlightenment philosophy, colonial declarations, English political traditions, and arguments already circulating through America. He did not invent the idea that governments derived authority from the people. His achievement was to compress a case for separation into language that felt universal. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness transformed a colonial dispute into a claim about human purpose. Governments existed to secure rights. When they became destructive, people could alter or abolish them. The force of the language came partly from its refusal to remain local. Congress needed foreign recognition and domestic commitment, but the document reached beyond diplomatic necessity. It did not say that British colonists alone possessed equality. It announced that all men were created equal. In practice, many of its signers lived within systems of slavery, patriarchy, Indigenous dispossession, property restriction, and class deference. The sentence did not abolish those systems. It gave later generations a weapon with which to expose them. Jefferson's draft included a long accusation against King George III for supporting the transatlantic slave trade and inciting enslaved people against colonists. The passage was self-serving. It blamed the Crown for a trade colonial merchants and planters had eagerly sustained, and it treated British offers of freedom to enslaved people as another crime against white owners. Congress removed the passage. Delegates from colonies deeply invested in slavery objected, and northern commercial interests were not innocent. The deletion prevented a fractured and hypocritical complaint from entering the final text, but it also left slavery largely unspoken in the nation's founding announcement. The document's charges against the king transformed years of imperial dispute into a pattern of deliberate tyranny. Some claims simplified events. Parliament, not the king alone, had driven much policy. Colonists had resisted officials and laws through methods far more complicated than passive suffering. But declarations are instruments of persuasion, not neutral archives. Congress was explaining rebellion to the world and to uncertain Americans. It needed a villain, a history, and a moral threshold that had already been crossed. While Congress debated, women followed events through newspapers, letters, household conversations, and direct participation in the revolutionary economy. They organized boycotts, produced cloth, managed farms and businesses when men left, raised funds, carried information, and confronted shortages. Their work sustained resistance, but political language continued to define the independent citizen as male. Abigail Adams saw the opening clearly. Writing from Massachusetts to her husband John on March 31st, she asked the lawmakers creating new rules to remember the ladies, and warned that women would not consider themselves bound by laws in which they had no voice or representation. Her phrasing combined humour with a genuine critique of unchecked male power. John replied playfully that men would not repeal their masculine systems. The exchange is famous because affection did not erase disagreement. Inside one revolutionary marriage, the boundary of liberty was already under negotiation. Abigail's life also shows how politics depended on domestic endurance. While John attended Congress, she managed the farm, tenants, finances, children, correspondence, labor, illness, and wartime anxiety. She heard cannon from the conflict around Boston and took her young son to watch the distant battle on Breed's Hill in 1775. She advised, informed, criticized, and protected household interests. John occupied the public stage partly because Abigail held together the world behind him. Other women entered print more directly. Mercy Otis Warren wrote political satire and drama, attacking British authority. Phyllis Wheatley, an enslaved poet in Boston whose published work had already made her extraordinary in the Atlantic world, addressed George Washington in verse. Washington thanked her and invited her to visit his headquarters. Her position defied simple categories. Celebrated for literary genius, she remained bound within a society that doubted black intellect and permitted human ownership. Ordinary women's voices survive less often because archives preserved elite correspondence more reliably than spoken conversation.
Yet court records, account books, petitions, pension applications, advertisements, and military documents reveal their presence. A woman sold produce to an army. Another demanded payment for lodging soldiers. Another searched for a missing husband. Another accompanied a regiment and washed clothing for Russians. Another crossed military lines to protect children. Their politics could be patriot, loyalist, pacifist, divided, or opportunistic. Survival did not always permit ideological purity. As men mobilized, women sometimes faced both expanded responsibility and intensified scrutiny. A wife might control a farm's daily decisions, but still need legal authority to complete certain transactions. Wartime inflation made household management punishing. Salt, needles, cloth, tea, medicines, and other goods became scarce or expensive. Armies purchased or seized food. Currency lost value. A decision about when to sell grain could determine whether a family preserved savings or watched them dissolve. Crowds of women occasionally acted collectively over prices and supplies. Such protests did not fit elite ideals of quiet femininity, but hunger changed the meaning of respectability. Women confronted merchants accused of hoarding, demanded access to coffee or food, and used community pressure to enforce a moral economy in which survival outweighed speculative profit. Their actions remind us that the revolution was fought not only over abstract taxation, but also over who controlled necessities. On July 1st, Congress began final debate on independence. South Carolina and Pennsylvania initially opposed. Delaware's 2 present delegates were divided, and New York lacked permission to support the resolution. Delaware delegate Caesar Rodney received word that his presence was needed. He traveled through difficult weather from Dover to Philadelphia, arriving in time to break his delegation's tie. Stories later embellished the ride, but the underlying fact captures the physical nature of decision. A colony's vote could turn on whether one exhausted man reached a room before debate ended. On July 2nd, 12 colonial delegations voted for independence, with New York abstaining until it received authorization. John Adams believed that July 2nd would become the great anniversary, celebrated with bells, bonfires, games, guns, and illuminations. He was nearly correct about the rituals and wrong about the date. The legal decision occurred on the 2nd. The wording that explained it consumed the following days. Congress edited Jefferson's draft heavily. Delegates cut language, adjusted accusations, and sharpened phrasing. Jefferson disliked some changes, but authorship belonged to Congress once the committee submitted the text. Franklin and Adams had already suggested revisions. The familiar declaration emerged through collective editing, not solitary inspiration. Even its most immortal sentences passed across a table where practical politicians worried about unanimity. On July 4th, Congress approved the final text and ordered it printed. The handwritten parchment displayed today was engrossed later, and most delegates signed it on August 2nd or afterward, not in one dramatic gathering on July 4th. John Hancock and Secretary Charles Thompson authenticated the first printed version. Printer John Dunlap worked through the night producing broadsides that could be dispatched to assemblies, commanders, committees, and officials. Imagine the print shop after dark. Metal type locked in place, ink rolled across raised letters, damp sheets pressed one after another. Workers moved with urgency because words had become orders. The declaration was not yet a sacred object behind glass. It was wet ink on paper, smelling of oil and labour, intended to travel through rain and dust until people heard that an empire had been formally rejected. On July 8th, the declaration was read publicly in Philadelphia. Bells rang, crowds gathered. Later that evening, symbols of monarchy were removed. In New York, Washington's troops heard the document on July 9th. That night, soldiers and civilians pulled down the gilded lead statue of George III at Bowling Green. The destruction turned political separation into physical theatre. Fragments of the statue were later sent to Connecticut, where much of the lead was reportedly moulded into musket balls. The king's image became ammunition. Public readings mattered because many listeners would never own a copy. The voice of a reader gave the document force, and the crowd gave it meaning through cheers, silence, skepticism, or fear.
A farmer hearing it on courthouse steps might focus on independence from Britain. An enslaved listener might hear the claim to equality and recognise its exclusion. A loyalist might hear treason. An Indigenous diplomat might hear another British settler government claiming authority over territories beyond colonial control. Not every town celebrated. Some declarations were read under military protection. Loyalists hid their response. Pacifist Quakers objected to war, even when they had grievances against British policy. Families waited to see which army would prevail. The text declared a political fact that had yet to become a military reality. British ships were already approaching New York with the largest expeditionary force Britain had sent across the Atlantic to that time. The men who approved independence risked punishment if captured, though the later legend that every signer immediately lost fortune or family is exaggerated. Their danger was real, but uneven. Wealth and connection offered some protection. The greater immediate burden fell on soldiers, labourers, civilians in contested regions, enslaved people pursuing uncertain routes to freedom, and Indigenous communities caught between expanding powers. A sentence adopted in Philadelphia would be paid for in places whose inhabitants had never entered the room. State constitution making moved alongside independence. Virginia adopted a Declaration of Rights in June, asserting that all men were by nature equally free and independent, even as slavery remained embedded in the state. Pennsylvania's constitution created a highly democratic structure for its time, extending voting to tax-paying free men and placing power in a single-house legislature, but critics feared instability and excessive popular rule. Different states experimented because there was no agreed blueprint for Republican government. The word republic did not guarantee consensus. Some leaders envisioned government led by virtuous, propertied gentlemen who could rise above faction. Others wanted broader participation by ordinary farmers and artisans. Many feared standing armies as instruments of tyranny, even while depending on a continental army to survive. They praised public virtue, but operated in a marketplace driven by private interest. They rejected hereditary monarchy while continuing to inherit wealth, status, and enslaved labour. Freedom of religion developed unevenly within these experiments. Revolutionary opposition to established authority weakened some established churches, but legal privilege did not disappear at once. Religious tests remained. Minority faiths still faced suspicion. The Declaration's creator could unite readers across denominations while leaving doctrinal questions outside politics. Over time, disestablishment would become one of the Revolution's major transformations, but in 1776, the outcome remained unsettled. Independence also demanded a new emotional identity. Subjects had been taught to imagine the king as a symbolic father. His portrait hung in public buildings. His health was toasted. Laws ran in his name. Rejecting him required more than a vote. It required colonists to reinterpret loyalty as corruption and rebellion as duty. Rituals of destruction, new seals, new oaths, and new political language helped people cross that psychological distance. Oaths became powerful tools. Governments asked men to renounce allegiance to George III and promise loyalty to new states. Refusal could bring loss of office, voting rights, property, freedom of movement, or community trust. A spoken sentence separated citizen from suspect. For immigrants who had sworn earlier oaths, pacifists who rejected all swearing, and families with members on both sides, the demand could be morally and practically devastating. The Declaration did not instantly unify the population. Historians cannot reduce 1776 to neat thirds of patriots, loyalists, and neutrals. Loyalties changed across time and place and are difficult to count. Some people committed early, others responded to the behaviour of nearby troops. An army that paid fairly gained friends. An army that stole livestock created enemies. Political allegiance could emerge from a violated barn, an insult at a checkpoint, the arrest of a relative, or the promise of protection. For enslaved people, the question was not whether British constitutional theory or congressional theory sounded more elegant, it was which side, in a particular place and moment, created a path out of bondage. Lord Dunmore, Virginia's last royal governor, had issued a proclamation in November 1775 offering freedom to enslaved men owned by rebels if they joined British forces. The offer excluded people owned by Loyalists and was designed to weaken rebellion, not abolish slavery. Yet its motive mattered less than its opening. Hundreds fled toward British lines, and the words moved through enslaved communities far beyond the reach of official newspapers. Patriot slaveholders reacted with fury and fear. The same men who denounced British attempts to enslave America confronted enslaved people who interpreted liberty literally.
Dunmore organised an Ethiopian regiment whose uniforms bore a slogan proclaiming liberty to slaves. Disease, especially smallpox, devastated many of those who escaped. British policy shifted and varied through the war, and thousands who sought freedom would face abandonment, re-enslavement, or precarious exile. Still, their flight made them actors in the revolution rather than background victims. Some black men served the Patriot cause, particularly in northern forces, though policies changed and commanders worried about arming enslaved people. Free black sailors and soldiers had already participated in colonial military life. Enslaved men sometimes served as substitutes or with promises of manumission that might later be disputed. The war opened doors and traps simultaneously. A uniform could offer wages, mobility, community, danger, and a claim to citizenship, without guaranteeing that white society would honour any of them. On paper, July 1776 had created a new nation. On the ground, a woman still bent over a wash kettle. A printer reset type. A soldier scratched at lice beneath his shirt. An enslaved man listened for news from a British ship. A loyalist hid letters beneath floorboards. A farmer studied a nearly worthless promise of payment. A native leader considered whether the people now calling themselves independent intended to become less hungry for land or more. The ceremony was over quickly. The hard question remained. Could these states survive the consequences of the words they had approved? Through the summer, the answer seemed increasingly likely to be no. British sails multiplied off New York until the harbour appeared to fill with moving walls of canvas. Warships, transports, supply vessels, and smaller craft carried tens of thousands of British and German troops, sailors, officers, servants, horses, guns, tents, uniforms, food, and equipment. Their arrival revealed the scale of the empire the Americans had challenged. New York residents climbed to rooftops or stood along the shore, watching a military city assemble upon the water. The British expedition was not composed only of men born in Britain. The Crown contracted with several German states for troops, the largest contingent coming from Hesse-Kassel. Americans called them Hessians, reducing diverse German soldiers to one frightening name. Patriot propaganda portrayed them as foreign mercenaries unleashed upon innocent farmers. Many were professional soldiers whose rulers received money for their service. They marched under discipline into a conflict whose local grievances they had not created, and some would desert, settle, or die in a country that had first known them as enemies. General William Howe commanded the army, while his brother, Admiral Richard Howe, led naval forces. Both possessed authority to negotiate within limits, creating the strange spectacle of invasion accompanied by peace offers. They hoped to destroy or divide resistance and restore imperial control. To many British leaders, the rebellion remained a domestic insurrection inflated by a determined minority. A decisive defeat might bring the population back to allegiance. Washington faced an impossible geography. New York was surrounded by navigable water that gave the Royal Navy freedom of movement. The Americans tried to defend Manhattan, Long Island, and approaches along an extended perimeter with inexperienced troops. Fortifications consumed labour. Men dug earth, raised redoubts, cut trees, moved cannon, and slept beneath inadequate shelter. Commanders disagreed over where the British would land. Rumours changed hourly. The Continental Army was becoming more organised, but it remained a fragile institution. Soldiers came from different colonies with different accents, uniforms, habits and expectations. New England men mocked Southerners. Southerners mocked New Englanders.
Officers appointed by provincial authorities fought over precedence. Some men had trained in local militias, but few had experienced large European-style battles. The army required them to obey strangers, endure monotony, and remain when danger became real. Uniformity existed more in orders than in appearance. Some regiments wore matching coats, others arrived in hunting shirts, work clothes, old uniforms, or whatever households could provide. Shoes wore through quickly. Linen shirts absorbed sweat and dirt. Wool coats became heavy in rain. Knapsacks, blankets, cartridge boxes, canteens, muskets and tools added weight. A soldier's visible equipment represented a supply chain stretching from Congress through state authorities, contractors, wagoners, craftsmen, quartermasters and families. One failure along that chain could leave him barefoot. The musket was not a magical equalizer.
It was heavy, inaccurate at long distances, vulnerable to damp powder, and effective through massed fire and disciplined loading. A trained soldier bit open a paper cartridge, poured powder, loaded ball and paper, rammed the charge, primed the pan if required, raised the weapon, and fired through smoke thick enough to obscure the line. Bayonets mattered because British regulars were trained to close with them. Many American muskets lacked bayonets, turning the moment after firing into terror if the enemy continued forward. Camp life occupied far more time than combat. Men dug latrines, carried water, cooked, cleaned weapons, stood guard, drilled, repaired roads, built fortifications, gathered firewood, and waited. They played games, sang, argued, drank, wrote letters, prayed, stole, and deserted. Officers issued repeated sanitation orders because men ignored designated sinks, butchered animals too near tents, or left refuse where flies could spread disease.
Military discipline was an attempt to control bodies that brought civilian habits into crowded camps. Food rations existed on paper: meat, bread or flour, and sometimes peas, rice, beer, cider or rum. Delivery failed often. Raw flour did not become bread without ovens, fuel, skill and time. Meat could arrive spoiled. Soldiers cooked in small mess groups using kettles and improvised equipment. A hungry army foraged, purchased, requisitioned and stole. Civilians near camps learned to hide livestock and grain, or sell at prices soldiers resented. Women travelled with armies in numbers that commanders both needed and distrusted. They were soldiers' wives, partners, widows, refugees, laundresses, cooks, nurses, sutlers and labourers. The dismissive term camp follower can hide their essential work. They washed filthy clothing, tended sick men, prepared food, carried water, and maintained families in motion. Armies rationed some women because without their labour, disease and disorder could worsen. Commanders also expelled those considered disruptive when supplies ran low. Children travelled too. A military camp might contain babies, boys running errands, and girls helping mothers work. War did not separate a clean male battlefield from a distant female home front. Households moved inside the army's orbit. A cannonade could threaten a soldier, his wife washing nearby, and their child sleeping beneath a blanket. When a regiment marched suddenly, the family had to keep pace or be left exposed. Medical practice mixed learning, experience, and desperate improvisation. Regimental surgeons amputated shattered limbs, treated wounds, lanced infections, prescribed purges, and tried to manage fevers they could not fully explain. Anesthesia did not exist. Alcohol might dull fear but could not remove pain. Yet surgery was not always the greatest killer. Dysentery, typhus, respiratory disease, and smallpox could take men who had never seen the enemy. Crowding, contaminated water, malnutrition, lice, and exhaustion defeated medical theory. Hospitals were often converted houses, churches, barns, or public buildings. Bedding was insufficient, ventilation varied, nurses cleaned, fed, restrained, and comforted patients amid smells of waste, sweat, blood, medicine, and decay. Supplies disappeared. Administrators struggled to identify responsibility between regimental and general hospitals. A wounded man might wait on transport, lose track of his unit, and have his wages or belongings stolen while he lay helpless. Discipline could be savage. Courts-martial punished desertion, sleeping on guard, theft, mutiny, disobedience, and cowardice. Sentences included lashes administered before assembled troops. Public pain instructed everyone watching. Washington needed an army that could stand against professionals, and he believed discipline essential. Revolutionary soldiers fought in the name of liberty, inside an institution built on command and punishment. That paradox was not accidental. Armies cannot vote on every order under fire. Desertion had many meanings. Some men fled fear. Others left because enlistment terms were disputed, families needed labour, pay failed, clothes disintegrated, or officers abused them. A farmer soldier could believe in independence and still decide that harvesting his own crop mattered more than remaining in camp. Authorities called it desertion. His children might call it survival. On August 22nd, British forces began landing on Long Island, using naval power to move men with astonishing efficiency. Thousands came ashore near Gravesend Bay. Loyalists provided intelligence and guidance. American units watched roads through wooded terrain, uncertain where the main blow would fall. The landscape that later became Brooklyn neighborhoods was then a mixture of villages, farms, hills, passes, and fields. The Battle of Long Island unfolded through the night of August 26th and morning of August 27th. British forces fixed American attention at defensive positions, while the large column made a long flanking march through the lightly guarded Jamaica Pass. Local Loyalist knowledge aided the manoeuvre. At dawn, Americans found enemies to front and rear. Confusion turned into retreat. Units broke. Men ran through fields, marshes, and roads under fire. Some American troops fought with extraordinary determination, including Maryland soldiers who launched repeated attacks near the old stone house to cover retreating comrades. Later memory called them the Maryland 400, though their exact number remains debated. Heroism did not change the result. The Americans fell back into fortified Brooklyn Heights, with the East River behind them and the British Army in front. Washington crossed from Manhattan and saw the danger. If Howe stormed the lines, or the Royal Navy entered the river effectively, much of the Continental Army could be trapped. Rain fell. Wind and weather complicated naval movement. During the night of August 29th into the next morning, American troops withdrew across the East River in small boats, many handled by experienced mariners from Marblehead, Massachusetts, under Colonel John Glover. The evacuation required silence, order, and luck. Units waited without knowing the plan. Wheels were wrapped or movement controlled to reduce noise. Men boarded boats in darkness while fires continued to suggest occupation. A fog settled over the area, helping conceal the final stages. Washington reportedly remained until the last troops departed. When the British discovered the empty works, the army they might have captured was gone. The retreat became a story of providence, but it was also a story of skilled labour. The boatmen knew tides, oars, currents, and crowded water. Their maritime experience saved soldiers whose political importance overshadowed the hands rowing them. Great events often depend on people later placed at the edge of the painting. New York civilians experienced the campaign as invasion, evacuation, occupation, and uncertainty. Families loaded carts and boats with bedding, furniture, tools, documents, and children. Some left too late and abandoned goods. Poor residents could not move as easily as the wealthy. Free and enslaved black people calculated whether British arrival offered escape, employment, danger, or all three. Loyalists emerged from concealment or arrived behind British protection. Property changed hands through military use, confiscation, theft, and necessity. Washington tried to hold Manhattan, but could not prevent British movement. At Kipps Bay on September 15th, British warships bombarded the shore and troops landed. American defenders broke.
Washington, furious, attempted to rally fleeing men and exposed himself dangerously close to the enemy. Later accounts turned the scene into a lesson about shame and leadership. For the soldiers under naval gunfire, flight was a physical response to a terrifying concentration of force. American troops fought more effectively the following day at Harlem Heights, gaining a small but valuable psychological success. The engagement did not reverse the campaign, but men who had retreated discovered they could push British light infantry back. Morale is difficult to measure and impossible to ignore. An army survives not only through numbers, but through the belief that tomorrow's resistance is meaningful. On the night of September 20th, fire broke out in New York and swept through hundreds of buildings. Wind carried flames across streets. Residents and soldiers fought the blaze amid confusion. The cause remains uncertain. British authorities suspected Patriot arson. Patriots blamed accident or British behaviour. Nathan Hale, the American officer captured while gathering intelligence, was executed the next morning, though there is no solid evidence linking him to the fire. The burning city became another theatre of accusation. In catastrophe, people wanted intention because intention supplied an enemy. Suspected incendiaries were seized and violence erupted. Families who had remained lost homes and goods in hours. Black residents were particularly vulnerable to suspicion. The charred district remained a wound throughout the British occupation, and many displaced people crowded into surviving buildings or makeshift spaces. Nathan Hale's death quickly entered Patriot memory. A young Connecticut officer and former schoolteacher, he had volunteered for espionage, crossed behind British lines in disguise, and was caught. The famous statement about regretting only one life for his country was reported indirectly and may not preserve his exact words. The legend reveals what the struggling cause needed: a calm martyr whose sacrifice transformed failed intelligence work into moral victory. Espionage in 1776 rarely resembled the clean, secret codes of later fiction. Information came from deserters, travellers, sailors, merchants, servants, women moving through households, enslaved workers overlooked by officers, and local residents who knew roads and routines. Reports were contradictory. A spy could be motivated by money, belief, revenge, or coercion. Capture meant imprisonment or death, and successful work often vanished from the record precisely because secrecy succeeded. The British occupied New York City for the rest of the war. It became a base filled with soldiers, Loyalist refugees, administrators, merchants, sailors, prisoners, and people escaping slavery. Occupation created business for some and misery for others. Rents rose, supplies fluctuated, crime and prostitution became targets of complaint. Military authority penetrated civilian life. The city was both refuge and prison, depending on who entered it. American prisoners suffered terribly in New York jails and, later, prison ships. In 1776, the system was already overcrowded after battlefield captures. Churches and buildings were converted into confinement spaces. Food, clothing, sanitation and medical care were grossly inadequate. Disease spread among weakened men. Guards could be brutal, though administrative neglect killed as effectively as deliberate cruelty. Prisoners faced pressure to enlist in British service or change allegiance. For families, capture created a long silence. A wife might hear only that a regiment had been defeated. Was her husband dead, wounded, imprisoned, deserted, or walking home? Letters travelled slowly and often failed. Lists contained misspelt names. Officers lacked information. The emotional geography of war extended from a prison floor in New York to a kitchen hundreds of miles away, where someone watched the road. The campaign moved north on Manhattan and into Westchester County. British forces landed at Throg's Neck, were delayed, then manoeuvred through another point. Washington withdrew to avoid encirclement. At White Plains on October 28th, British troops attacked and captured Chatterton Hill. The Americans retreated again. Each movement preserved part of the army while yielding ground, reinforcing an appearance of inevitable British control. The forts along the Hudson became the next danger. American leaders hoped Fort Washington on Manhattan and Fort Lee across the river could obstruct British shipping. Washington doubted whether Fort Washington should be held, but command decisions and confidence delayed evacuation. On November 16th, British and German forces attacked from several directions. The garrison surrendered, and nearly 3,000 American troops became prisoners. Among those caught in the battle's violence was Margaret Corbin, who had accompanied her husband John, an artilleryman. When he was killed at his gun, she helped continue firing until grape shots severely wounded her. She survived with lasting disability and later received support from the Continental Congress. Her story does not need to be transformed into legend. Its power lies in the visible reality of a woman at an artillery position, because war had already erased the imagined boundary around her role. Fort Lee soon had to be abandoned. Soldiers fled before British forces could close the trap, leaving tents, cannon, supplies, and food. The loss was more than material. An army that could not equip itself had surrendered precious stores. Men marched into New Jersey in cold weather, some without adequate shoes or blankets, watched by civilians deciding whether the revolution was dying. British and Hessian columns crossed New Jersey, pursuing the shrinking American force. Towns submitted or sought protection. Thousands of residents took advantage of proclamations offering pardon to those who renewed allegiance to the king. Some were genuine Loyalists. Others made a practical calculation under occupation. A paper promising protection might save a house, though soldiers did not always respect it. Military foraging became indistinguishable from plunder in the eyes of many civilians. Troops took livestock, grain, bedding, clothing, and liquor. Officers attempted regulation, but armies dispersed over countryside were difficult to control. Reports of assault and destruction spread. British behaviour pushed some wavering residents toward the Patriot side, while American requisitions created their own resentments. Civilians discovered that both armies spoke of necessity when taking what families needed. For a farm household, the loss of one horse could cripple the next planting. The loss of a cow removed milk, butter, and future calves. Fence rails burned as fuel released animals and exposed crops. Orchards damaged in a day required years to replace. Military histories count guns and men. Households counted spoons, sheets, hens, tools, and seed. Washington's army crossed the Delaware River into Pennsylvania in early December, collecting or destroying boats along the New Jersey side to obstruct pursuit. Enlistments were due to expire at the end of the year. Men walked away. Congress departed Philadelphia for Baltimore. British commanders established winter posts across New Jersey, believing the campaigning season nearly over. The revolution appeared reduced to a few thousand exhausted soldiers and a commander with more responsibility than power. The Navy offered no immediate rescue. Congress had created a continental navy and commissioned vessels, but it could not challenge British command of the sea on equal terms. Naval warfare depended heavily on privateers, privately owned ships authorized to capture enemy commerce. Investors hoped for profit, sailors hoped for prize money. Governments hoped privateering would damage trade and draw experienced mariners into the cause. Privateers blurred patriotism and business. A successful cruise could bring a captured ship and cargo into port for legal condemnation and sale. An unsuccessful one could end in death, imprisonment, or financial ruin. Privateering also competed with the Continental Navy and merchant service for sailors. Men chose the berth offering the best combination of wages, prize prospects, and survival. Ideology sailed beside self-interest. At sea, ordinary life was cramped, wet, dangerous, and disciplined. Crews slept among equipment and each other. Food deteriorated. Fresh water grew stale. Storms threatened spars and hulls. Accidents maimed men far from surgeons. Combat added splintering wood, smoke, cannon recoil, and boarding. Even without battle, disease could weaken a crew. The romance of a fast schooner chasing a prize conceals the labour of pumping, reefing, hauling, scraping, cooking, repairing, and watching through darkness. American commerce raiding mattered, but British naval power shaped the war's boundaries. It moved armies, supplied occupation, raided coasts, and connected American loyalists to a global empire.
Yet the Royal Navy also had to protect an immense network, stretching through the Caribbean, Atlantic, Mediterranean, and beyond. The rebellion was local to American families and international to strategists. France and Spain watched closely, judging whether the new states could survive long enough to deserve alliance. By December, foreign observers had little reason for confidence. New York was lost, thousands were prisoners, the army was retreating, paper currency weakened, state and congressional authority competed. The British expected loyal support to grow once their strength became undeniable. If Washington dissolved into winter, independence might remain a magnificent document attached to a failed rebellion. But armies do not experience history as an inevitable direction. They experience one night, one meal, one march, and one decision at a time. Along the Delaware, men repaired weapons and wrapped torn cloth around feet. Officers searched for boats and intelligence. Militia came and went. Civilians carried rumors across the river. Washington understood that avoiding destruction was no longer enough. The cause needed a victory people could see. Beyond the main armies, another war was taking shape along the boundaries of colonial settlement. Later national memory would often frame the revolution as a contest between Americans and British, with indigenous nations entering only as allies of one side or the other. That picture reverses the perspective. Native peoples were not guests in a European conflict. They were nations defending homelands, trade, diplomatic independence and survival, while two groups of outsiders fought over authority to expand across their country. The continent west of the Appalachians was not an empty prize waiting for settlement. It contained towns, fields, hunting territories, paths, councils, sacred places, and political networks. Haudenosaunee communities of the Six Nations occupied lands across what is now New York and beyond. Cherokees lived across a vast southern territory. Shawnees, Delawares, Miamis, Creeks, Choctaws, Chickasaws, and many other peoples pursued distinct strategies. No single native position existed because no single native political authority ruled them all. Diplomacy required deep knowledge. Wampum belts preserved agreements and gave material form to words. Speeches followed protocols. Gifts created obligations. Kinship language defined relationships between nations and empires. Interpreters carried enormous responsibility because a mistranslated metaphor or deliberate distortion could redirect policy. European officials often imagined treaties as permanent land transfers recorded on paper. Indigenous participants might understand the same agreements through relationships of shared use, alliance, or limited permission. The difference produced conflict that one side later described as violation and the other as theft. For decades, native leaders had balanced British, French, colonial, and intertribal interests. The 7 Years' War had removed France as a major territorial power in mainland eastern North America, weakening the diplomatic balance many nations had used to protect autonomy. British victory did not bring peace. Pontiac's war and subsequent violence persuaded imperial officials that uncontrolled colonial expansion was expensive. The Proclamation Line of 1763 attempted to restrict settlement west of the Appalachian watershed. Land-hungry colonists treated the restriction as imperial obstruction. This was a fundamental revolutionary contradiction. Many colonists opposed Britain partly because imperial government limited Western expansion. Men who used the language of natural rights also speculated in native land. George Washington had invested in Western Plains. Other elites imagined the Ohio Valley as the source of future estates and wealth. For indigenous nations, American independence threatened to remove one imperfect barrier between their homelands and a rapidly growing settler population. The Haudenosaunee Confederacy faced agonizing pressure. The Mohawk, Oneida, Onondaga, Cayuga, Seneca, and Tuscarora nations shared a confederated political tradition, but retained separate councils and interests. British officials sought support. American commissioners appealed for neutrality or alliance, invoking old friendship, while settlers continued to covet land. Missionary ties, trade relations, family connections, and local experience pulled communities in different directions. In 1776, many Haudenosaunee leaders still tried to avoid being consumed by the conflict. Council diplomacy emphasised that the dispute had begun within the British family and should not require native blood. But neutrality became harder as war moved closer and both sides demanded assistance. Mohawk leader Thayendanegea, known to the British as Joseph Brant, travelled to Britain and returned, convinced that alliance with the Crown offered a stronger defence against American expansion.
The Oneida, influenced partly by missionary Samuel Kirkland and their own strategic judgments, leaned toward the Americans. The Confederacy would divide more openly as the war continued, turning a struggle against colonial intrusion into an internal wound. Native people evaluated British promises with caution. The Crown had issued protective boundaries and failed to stop settlers. British traders could exploit debt. Officials changed. Gifts arrived late. Yet the empire at least possessed an interest in regulating expansion, while revolutionary governments were composed of settlers demanding access to land. Alliance with Britain was not blind loyalty to George III. It was often a calculated choice between dangerous futures. In the South, Cherokee communities confronted immediate encroachment. In 1775, land speculator Richard Henderson and his Transylvania Company negotiated the Treaty of Sycamore Shoals with some Cherokee leaders for an enormous tract in present-day Kentucky and Tennessee. Colonial governments rejected the private company's authority, but settlers still poured through the Cumberland Gap. Dragging Canoe, a Cherokee leader, fiercely opposed the cession and warned that the land would become a dark and bloody ground. By the summer of 1776, younger Cherokee warriors associated with Dragging Canoe struck frontier settlements. Their campaign was not a sudden eruption of irrational violence. It responded to repeated invasion and failed diplomacy. Settlers nevertheless experienced attacks as terror. Families crowded into forts. Fields went untended. Messengers carried alarms. Captivity, killing, property destruction, and retaliatory hatred spread along a border where rumour could move faster than verified information. Colonial forces from Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia retaliated with overwhelming destructive expeditions. Militias entered Cherokee country, burned towns, cut down corn, destroyed stored food, and forced residents to flee. The objective extended beyond defeating warriors. Destroying houses and harvests used hunger as a weapon against entire communities. Patriot accounts celebrated victory. Cherokee families faced winter after watching years of labour disappear in smoke. Some Cherokee leaders sought peace under unbearable pressure and ceded more territory in 1777. Dragging Canoe and followers moved south and west, establishing new towns and continuing resistance. The pattern would repeat across American history. Settlement produced conflict, conflict justified military destruction, defeat produced a treaty, and the treaty opened land to further settlement. Each new line was presented as a conclusion until settlers crossed it. Along these frontiers, people lived in fortified stations, isolated farms, mission communities, and native towns connected by paths Europeans often misunderstood. The log fort of popular imagination was rarely an impregnable castle. It might be a collection of cabins enclosed by a palisade, crowded with frightened families and livestock during alarm. Water, sanitation, food, and disease became serious problems when people remained inside. Men stood guard while women cooked, nursed, repaired clothing, and watched children who had been taught to respond to danger before they understood its politics. Captivity carried special terror in colonial stories, but reality did not follow one script. Native war parties sometimes adopted captives to replace relatives lost through war and disease, integrating outsiders into families and communities. Others held captives for exchange, labour, leverage, or ransom. Some captives resisted and escaped. Some chose to remain, especially if taken young or treated as kin. Colonial authorities found such choices disturbing because they challenged the assumption that European society was naturally preferable. Native people taken by colonists rarely received the same attention in later narratives. Colonial forces seized prisoners, including women and children, for exchange or confinement.
Settlers occupied abandoned towns and fields. Scalp bounties, mutilation, and indiscriminate killing had been used in earlier wars and remained within living memory. Violence crossed cultural boundaries, but power shaped whose violence became legend and whose became policy. The revolution also affected native economies. War disrupted hunting, planting, trade routes, and access to tools, powder, cloth, metal goods, and medicine. Communities had incorporated imported goods into life without surrendering their identities.
A metal kettle or musket was not proof of dependence, any more than colonial use of indigenous corn, canoes, snowshoes, or geographic knowledge made colonists culturally native. Exchange transformed everyone while leaving political differences intact. The very survival of colonial settlements depended on indigenous knowledge, often erased from the story. Corn, beans, squash, and methods of cultivation shaped American diets. Native trails became roads. Knowledge of rivers and passes guided military movement. Place names endured beneath English spellings. Yet settlers converted learning into claims of possession. They admired the usefulness of native knowledge while imagining native people disappearing from the future. That imagined disappearance was false in 1776 and remains false today. Indigenous nations adapted, negotiated, fought, rebuilt, and survived policies designed to remove them. Their presence changes the meaning of the revolution.
A nation celebrating liberation was also accelerating a continental project that would deny sovereignty to peoples already there. The same widening lens transforms the meaning of slavery. On a Chesapeake plantation in 1776, tobacco fields did not resemble the neat green geometry later preserved by Romantic paintings. The work was relentless. Seedbeds had to be prepared, plants transplanted, weeds removed, worms picked from leaves, stalks topped, leaves harvested, cured, sorted, bundled, inspected, and transported. Tobacco exhausted soil, encouraging expansion onto new land. It also exhausted human bodies. Work began under supervision and threat. Overseers or owners measured performance. Whipping was not an exceptional breakdown of plantation order. The possibility of violence sustained that order every day. Families lived with the knowledge that disobedience could bring punishment and debt could bring sale. The law protected ownership far more consistently than it protected an enslaved person's body, marriage, or parenthood. Yet plantations were not places where enslaved people ceased to live as human beings. They formed families, named children, worshipped, told stories, cultivated gardens, prepared food, traded, joked, mourned, argued, healed, made music, and remembered Africa through practices transformed by American conditions. Love existed under slavery, not because the system allowed it, but because people created bonds the system continually threatened. Marriage between enslaved people often lacked secure legal recognition. Owners might permit ceremonies and then sell one partner. Children inherited the status of an enslaved mother, making reproduction a source of wealth to slaveholders. Parents taught survival, kinship, skill, language, and caution, while knowing they could not guarantee remaining together. The phrase family separation sounds administrative. The lived event was a child watching a parent vanish down a road. Some estates contained dozens or hundreds of enslaved people, others only one or two. On a large plantation, community networks could be extensive, and specialized workers might include carpenters, coopers, blacksmiths, boatmen, drivers, nurses, cooks, and artisans. On a small farm or in a townhouse, an enslaved person could live under constant observation, isolated from family, sleeping near the owner, and never escaping command. Scale changed experience, but not the central fact of ownership. Resistance took forms more numerous than open revolt. People slowed work, broke tools, concealed food, preserved forbidden meetings, negotiated task expectations, feigned illness, learned to read, stole time, challenged an overseer, protected fugitives, or escaped temporarily to visit family. These acts rarely appear in official documents unless owners noticed them as problems. The archive describes disorder, where the enslaved person may have experienced a small victory. Open rebellion remained a powerful fear among slaveholders. Memories of the Stono Rebellion in South Carolina and other resistance shaped patrols and law. White communities required passes for black movement, restricted gatherings, and monitored weapons. The numerical strength of enslaved populations in the Low Country made elite luxury feel permanently vulnerable. Grand houses displayed confidence, statutes revealed fear. Revolutionary language intensified that fear because its metaphors were impossible to contain. Patriot writers described taxation as slavery and political submission as chains. Enslaved listeners heard white men declare that resistance to bondage was a natural duty. Some petitioned for freedom using the colonists' own language. In Massachusetts, groups of enslaved people submitted petitions during the Revolutionary era, arguing that they possessed a natural right to liberty. Their reasoning exposed the difference between metaphorical slavery and actual sale. Free black communities also navigated dangerous ground. Freedom could rest on manumission papers, vulnerable to theft or challenge. A free person might be kidnapped and sold. Work opportunities were constrained by discrimination. Taxes and laws could impose special burdens. Yet free black sailors, craftsmen, labourers, property holders, congregants and soldiers built families and institutions. Their existence contradicted arguments that African descent naturally implied enslavement. At sea, black mariners moved through a world that could offer unusual mobility and extreme danger. Ships required labour and sometimes valued skill more immediately than status ashore. A sailor might visit multiple ports, carry news, and form international connections. He could also be seized, sold, impressed, injured, or abandoned. Maritime freedom was always unstable under a racial slave system. The British presence created one of the largest movements of enslaved people in the era. Individuals and families fled toward troops and ships, sometimes after hearing distorted versions of Dunmore's offer. British officers responded inconsistently. Some employed fugitives as labourers, guides, pilots, cooks, pioneers, or soldiers. Some returned them to Loyalist owners. Some claimed them personally. Disease killed many crowded into camps without adequate shelter. Freedom was being pursued inside an empire that still supported slavery elsewhere. Patriot authorities faced a military dilemma. They needed manpower, but feared that arming black men would challenge racial order. Washington had initially resisted further enlistment of black soldiers, then allowed free black men who had already served to re-enlist. State policies varied. Rhode Island's later black regiment belonged to 1778, not 1776, but the debate that would produce it was already embedded in wartime necessity. White soldiers sometimes served beside black soldiers while remaining invested in slavery. Shared danger could create respect without abolishing prejudice. A black veteran might return from service expecting a claim upon liberty and citizenship, only to encounter old restrictions. The revolution made equality imaginable and postponement politically convenient. Indentured servitude created another form of unfreedom, distinct from slavery, but significant. European migrants who lacked passage money could contract years of labour. Their service ended at a specified term and did not automatically pass to children, crucial differences from racial hereditary slavery. Yet servants could be bought and sold for the remainder of contracts, punished, pursued after escape, and have terms extended.
Women servants faced sexual exploitation and additional penalties if pregnancy disrupted labour. The war destabilised these contracts. Servants ran to armies, fled during occupation, or negotiated from a position of labour scarcity. Masters advertised for return. Some British and Patriot recruiters accepted men whose legal obligations were unclear. Revolutionary claims about consent sounded different to someone whose time had been sold. Poor free labourers likewise experienced independence through material vulnerability. Day labour depended on demand. Injury could eliminate income instantly. There was no modern workers' compensation, social insurance, or public hospital network. Relief came through family, church, town support, mutual aid, charity, or the humiliating mechanisms of poor law. Communities distinguished between the deserving and undeserving poor, judgments shaped by reputation and prejudice. In New England towns, local authorities might place impoverished people with households that agreed to support them at low cost, sometimes auctioning care to the lowest bidder. Children could be bound out. The system claimed to maintain community responsibility, but could expose vulnerable people to exploitation. Independence from Britain did not mean independence from hunger, disability, age, or the decisions of overseers of the poor. Regional difference affected every category. New England's mixed farms, fisheries, timber, shipbuilding, and commercial ports produced one social landscape. The wheat regions of Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Delaware, and parts of New York produced another. The Chesapeake's tobacco plantations and dispersed settlement shaped politics differently from the rice and indigo lowcountry. Backcountry districts connected through wagon roads and kin networks often resented coastal elites as much as imperial officials. Ethnicity complicated those regions further. German-speaking communities in Pennsylvania and neighbouring areas included Lutherans, Reformed congregations, Moravians, Mennonites, Amish, and others with different relationships to war. Some pacifist groups refused military service from religious conviction and faced fines or suspicion. Recent immigrants might feel little attachment to British constitutional identity. Revolutionary officials needed translations because political loyalty could not be assumed to speak English. Scots-Irish settlers, many descended from Ulster Protestants, occupied frontier areas and often carried memories of conflict, tenancy, migration, and distrust of authority. Scottish Highland migrants in other regions could remain strongly loyalist because of recent ties, military tradition, land grants, or gratitude to the Crown after displacement. Ethnic background did not mechanically determine side. Local circumstance mattered more than later stereotype. The colonies also contained Dutch families in New York, French Huguenot descendants, Welsh communities, Sephardic and Ashkenazic Jews, Irish Catholics, Acadians, and people whose identities crossed imperial categories. African-born and American-born black populations spoke different languages and carried diverse cultural memories. The Revolution's public language simplified this world into Americans and Britons. Daily life refused to become so neat. Language itself sounded different from the polished voices used in modern reenactments. Accents varied by region, class, ethnicity, and generation. English grammar and vocabulary had not frozen into one standard. German, Dutch, French, Gaelic, African languages, and native languages shaped conversation. Many people were multilingual because trade, diplomacy, family, or survival required it. An interpreter might hold more practical power in a negotiation than the uniformed official beside him. That summer and autumn, news of independence travelled unevenly through this multilingual continent. A printed broadside reached a county seat. A minister translated its meaning. A traveller summarised it badly. A soldier repeated one sentence. An enslaved worker overheard a discussion through an open window. A native council received an explanation framed by a diplomatic agent seeking alliance. There was no single moment when everyone understood that a nation had been born. For many, nothing visible changed on the morning after the announcement. Rent remained due, crops required work, owners still issued orders, courts still recorded debts, British troops still advanced. But a new claim had entered the world, and claims can outlive the people who first limit them. Equality now existed in the official language of a slave-holding republic. Popular sovereignty existed in states that restricted voting. Independence existed in a society dependent on women's unpaid labour, native land, Atlantic credit, and coerced work. The untold truth is not that the revolution was false. It is that it was incomplete at the moment of its greatest eloquence. Its ideals were powerful enough to inspire sacrifice and selective enough to protect hierarchy. The people excluded from its immediate promises would spend generations insisting that the words meant what they said. While declarations and armies transformed politics, the physical limits of the 18th century continued to govern every body. A toothache could become a crisis. Dentistry offered extraction, cleaning,
filing, and replacement teeth for those who could pay, but no modern anesthesia, sterile instruments, or reliable prevention. People rubbed aching gums with spirits, herbs, oils, powders, or patent remedies. A barber, surgeon, physician, or local specialist might pull the tooth with instruments that made speed a form of mercy.
Medicine in 1776 was not simply ignorance dressed in wigs. Physicians studied anatomy, read European texts, observed patients, debated disease, and used an inherited system that often failed them. Many believed health depended on balancing bodily humours and prescribed bleeding, purging, blistering, sweating, or vomiting. Some treatments weakened patients already struggling to survive. Other practices, especially attention to diet, rest, drainage, wound care, and isolation, could help. The absence of germ theory did not mean the absence of careful observation. Most medical care occurred outside professional medicine. Mothers, midwives, neighbours, enslaved healers, native specialists, apothecaries, and experienced household members possessed knowledge of plants, childbirth, injuries, fevers, and nursing. Remedies crossed cultural lines, though Europeans often took indigenous or African knowledge without crediting its source. A useful plant could move from native practice into a colonial medical book and appear there as if discovered by the author. Professional access followed wealth and geography. In a city, a family might summon a university-trained physician. In a remote settlement, the nearest doctor could be many miles away or possess little formal education. Payment might be made in cash, produce, services, or long-delayed credit. A physician arrived on horseback, carrying limited instruments and medicines into a household where relatives had already made most important decisions. Pain was familiar but never trivial. People endured arthritis, broken bones healed badly, hernias, burns, parasites, skin infections, complications of childbirth, eye disease, and injuries from tools, animals, firearms, and fire. A farmer kicked by a horse could lose a season's labour. A seamstress with failing vision could lose income. A child who survived an infection might live with permanent hearing loss.
Disability was integrated into households through improvised work and care, yet those without support could fall rapidly into poverty. Mental suffering had few safe names. Grief might be described as melancholy. Trauma from battle, captivity, violence, or disaster appeared through nightmares, withdrawal, drinking, religious despair, rage, or bodily illness. Communities interpreted distress through morality, medicine, faith, and reputation. Affluent families might hide a troubled relative. Poor people could be confined or punished. The human nervous system was modern even when the language surrounding it was not. Alcohol was woven into sociability, commerce, medicine, and labour. Rum punch accompanied meetings. Cider appeared at meals. Taverns extended credit through drink. Employers sometimes supplied alcohol during harvesting or construction. Heavy consumption could be celebrated as hospitality and condemned as vice, often by the same community.
Public drunkenness created court cases, domestic violence, accidents, and poverty. But reform movements capable of changing national habits belonged to a later century. Meals followed season more than preference. Spring could be a hungry interval when winter stores declined before new crops matured. Salted meat, dried beans, grain, root vegetables, preserves, and smoked fish carried families through cold months. Fresh greens returned with relief. Summer produced berries, vegetables, milk, and relentless preservation work. Autumn slaughter and harvest filled cellars, lofts, barrels, crocks, and smokehouses, while reminding everyone that failure would be measured in winter hunger. Preservation was vulnerable. Salt cost money. Barrels leaked. Insects entered grain. Damp encouraged mould. Rats consumed stores. Milk spoiled. Meat turned. A household manager needed constant judgment, and mistakes smelled before they could be hidden. Wealth allowed more variety and backup. Poverty meant eating food at the edge of decay or going without. Cooking technology shaped flavour and danger.
The open hearth demanded knowledge of heat judged by eye and hand. Pots hung from cranes or hooks. Bake ovens were heated with fire and then cleared before bread entered. Cooks moved heavy vessels among coals while clothing passed close to flame. Recipes often assumed experience instead of giving exact times and temperatures. A skilled cook knew how wood, weather, pot, and ingredient altered the result. Corn was among the continent's essential foods, prepared as mush, bread, cakes, hominy, and meal in countless variations. European settlers survived partly by adopting crops and techniques developed by indigenous peoples, then built national mythology around self-sufficient farms, as if that knowledge had originated with them. Enslaved Africans similarly transformed foodways through ingredients, cultivation, seasoning, and technique. American cuisine was already a record of unequal encounters. Sugar connected a pleasant taste to immense violence. Molasses from Caribbean plantations entered northern distilleries and became rum. Tea could be sweetened with the product of enslaved labour, while consumers debated their own political bondage. Coffee, chocolate, spices, dyes, and tropical goods carried hidden geographies of work. Colonial households were more globally connected than their handmade furniture and dirt roads suggest. Consumption allowed ordinary people to imitate elite manners in small ways. A modest family might acquire a few printed ceramics or a tea set and perform rituals of refinement. Shopkeepers advertised choice. Fashion changed. This consumer revolution helped colonists feel British before boycotts taught them to display political virtue by refusing British goods. Resistance therefore demanded the surrender of habits empire had encouraged. Home production could not easily replace imperial manufacturing. Spinning gatherings made useful political theatre, but domestic wheels could not instantly supply all required cloth. Ironworks, mills, tanneries, rope walks, paper mills, and workshops expanded production, yet shortages remained. Armies required astonishing quantities of shoes, blankets, cartridges, tents, wagons, harness, barrels, guns, and powder. Independence needed industry it did not yet possess. Gunpowder revealed global dependence. Its ingredients and manufacture required specialized supply. Saltpeter could be extracted from decaying organic material and soil, sulfur had to be found or imported, and charcoal prepared correctly. Congress encouraged production, communities collected materials, and powder mills increased output. But quality varied, and explosions threatened workers. A political movement inspired by natural rights could fail for lack of chemical consistency. Women and children rolled paper cartridges for military use in some settings, filled with measured powder and ball. The work demanded care, because a spark could destroy a room. Needles made uniforms. Looms produced cloth. Blacksmiths repaired weapons. Wagoners moved supplies. The battlefield depended on a dispersed population whose names rarely appeared in reports. Animals were another hidden military and economic system. Horses carried officers, messages, artillery, wagons, and cavalry. Oxen pulled heavy loads more slowly. Cattle became moving meat supplies. Pigs foraged. Dogs guarded, hunted, and accompanied families. Animals suffered wounds, hunger, exhaustion, and seizure. An army's route could be traced through dead horses and stripped pasture. Farm animals also defined ordinary sound and smell. Roosters, pigs, cows, geese, barking dogs, flies, manure, and slaughter surrounded urban as well as rural residents. Charleston, Philadelphia, Boston, and New York were not sanitized museums. Markets generated blood and waste. Tanners, soap boilers, chandlers, brewers, distillers, and slaughterhouses produced odours essential to their trades. Wealthy residents complained and continued consuming what those trades made. Human waste entered privies, chamber pots, streets, yards, pits, and waterways. Better-run towns regulated removal and placement, but enforcement was imperfect. Night soil could be collected for fertilizer. Wells risked contamination from nearby waste. Rain washed filth through gutters. People recognized bad smells as dangerous, though their explanation of disease differed from modern microbiology. Cleanliness was pursued with the materials available, not ignored. Bathing practices varied. Full immersion was less routine than today,
But people washed hands, faces, and bodies in basins, changed linen, combed hair, and cleaned clothing when water, soap, warmth, privacy, and time allowed. Elite ideals valued clean linen because it absorbed sweat and signalled care. Labourers became dirty because work was dirty. Enslaved workers could be denied the time and supplies required to meet standards used to judge them. Wigs were real, but never universal. Elite men might shave or shorten hair and wear fashionable wigs for formal appearance, while many others tied back their own hair or wore practical caps and hats. Powder required maintenance and could contain starch scented in various ways. Portraits preserve people at their most deliberate, not as they appeared carrying firewood in rain. Faces bore marks modern viewers rarely see in idealized art. Smallpox scars were common. Teeth were missing or discolored. Skin reflected outdoor work, illness, nutrition, and smoke. Hands revealed occupation through calluses, burns, cuts, ink, dye, flour, soil, or tar. Age could arrive visibly early, but people did not become elderly at 30. Those who survived childhood and childbirth could live into their 60s, 70s, or beyond. Life expectancy at birth appears low because infant and child deaths weigh so heavily in the average. It does not mean every adult expected to die young. Families included grandparents, older artisans, widows, veterans of earlier wars, and elders whose memories reached back before many settlements existed. In native communities and African-descended families, elders carried histories that official colonial archives ignored. Memory was oral as well as written. Stories passed through repeated telling. Family Bibles recorded births and deaths. Account books preserved transactions. Marks carved into furniture or buildings claimed presence. Enslaved families, often denied legal records of kinship, maintained relationships through names, visits, community knowledge, and remembrance. Indigenous nations preserved history through oral traditions, ceremony, place, and material forms that European historians too often refuse to recognize as archives. Music crossed every social boundary. Psalms filled meeting houses. Fiddles, fifes, drums, flutes, and voices animated dances, camps, taverns, work, and domestic evenings. Enslaved musicians performed for white owners and for their own communities, adapting African and European forms into new traditions. Military drums regulated movement and carried signals, but they also stirred emotion. A familiar tune could make homesick men march another mile. Dancing raised moral suspicion in some communities and formed the centre of sociability in others. Elite assemblies displayed controlled movement, clothing, rank, and courtship. Rural gatherings could be less formal, but no less important. War interrupted and intensified such events. Officers attended balls even while campaigns continued. The contrast was not merely hypocrisy. Human beings sought music and flirtation beside danger, because danger made pleasure urgent. Courtship unfolded under supervision, convention, and improvisation. Young people met at church, markets, work, visits, dances, and community events. Letters allowed private feeling, though paper could be intercepted or preserved. Pregnancy before marriage was not unknown, and court records reveal disputes over promises, support, and paternity. Families cared about affection, but also property, reputation, labour, religion, and kinship. Marriage created an economic partnership, even when law placed the husband above the wife. On farms, survival required coordinated work. In artisan households, wives sold goods, kept shops, trained children, and sometimes continued a trade after widowhood. Historians often recover these women through phrases such as widow of or wife of, labels that conceal competence behind relationship. Domestic violence existed inside a culture that granted husbands broad authority, but did not accept every degree of abuse. Neighbours intervened inconsistently. Courts sometimes punished extreme cruelty or granted rare separations, yet women faced legal, economic, and social obstacles to escape. Revolutionary complaints against arbitrary power
did not automatically transform power within the home. Sexual violence was even more difficult to prosecute, especially for enslaved women whose owners held coercive access to their bodies. Children born from assault inherited enslaved status through their mothers, increasing an owner's property. White records frequently concealed paternity, while family resemblance made secrets visible. The elegant genealogy of a planter family could exist beside black descendants denied the name and inheritance of their fathers. Among free people, reputation shaped whether accusations were believed. Race, class, marital status, occupation, and prior behaviour all influenced judgments. Courts demanded evidence within legal standards built by men. Many assaults never reached a record. Silence in the archive should not be mistaken for safety in the past. Children learned social boundaries with the alphabet. White children absorbed ideas about rank, race, religion, gender, and obedience through household practice, as much as formal instruction. An elite child might be served by an enslaved adult and understand domination before understanding politics. An enslaved child learned when to lower eyes, when to listen, and whom to trust. Native children learned landscapes and relationships threatened by newcomers who described them as uncivilized. Play reproduced and challenged the adult world. Children used handmade dolls, hoops, balls, marbles, tops, toy weapons, improvised objects, and imagination. Boys rehearsed militia drill. Girls practiced domestic tasks through play. Enslaved and poor children created toys from available material. Laughter occupied the same yards where punishment occurred. The past becomes false when suffering is allowed to erase joy, just as it becomes false when joy is used to soften oppression. Education for elite boys could lead to colleges such as Harvard, Yale, Princeton, William and Mary, King's College, the College of Philadelphia, Brown, Dartmouth, Rutgers, or Hampton-Sydney, all small institutions by modern standards and several disrupted by war. Classical education emphasized Latin, Greek, rhetoric, logic, theology, and moral philosophy. Students also rioted, broke rules, accumulated debts, and complained about food. Future statesmen were still young men living under institutional discipline. Science and practical inquiry flourished despite limited instruments. Franklin's electrical experiments had given him international fame. Astronomers observed transits and eclipses. Surveyors measured land. Farmers tested crops. Artisans held technical knowledge embodied in hands. Natural philosophers collected specimens and classified the continent, sometimes treating native information as raw material for European systems. Weather remained immediate and poorly predicted. People read clouds, winds, animal behaviour, almanacs, and seasonal memory. A storm at sea could erase investment and lives. A late frost could destroy fruit. Drought reduced harvests and mill power. Rivers flooded roads and fields. Political leaders issued confident plans in an economy governed by weather they could not control. The year 1776 itself included extremes experienced locally rather than nationally. One region suffered heat while another recorded rain. Harvest quality varied. There was no centralized weather service collecting a shared picture. Diaries now allow historians to reconstruct conditions, but a farmer then knew only his sky and reports carried by travelers. News of war mingled with this daily attention to weather and crops. A diary might place a battle beside an observation about planting beans. That is not indifference. It is how history enters life. People cannot remain continuously inside grand events. Cows escape during revolutions. Roofs leak on declaration days. Children become ill while armies cross rivers. Objects from 1776 survive today because someone valued them, lost them, buried them, discarded them in conditions that preserved them, or passed them down with a story. Archaeologists recover buttons, pipe stems, ceramics, tools, bones, seeds, musket balls, buckles, and shards that restore ordinary behaviour. A broken bowl can reveal trade. Animal remains can reveal diet. Soil stains can mark a vanished house ignored by written history. Historic buildings survive more selectively. The homes of famous leaders received preservation, while slave quarters, workshops, tenements, native towns, barns, kitchens, and ordinary cabins disappeared. Even within preserved houses, visitors once moved from parlour to bedroom without seeing the labour spaces that made elite life possible. Modern interpretation increasingly opens kitchens, cellars, garrets, workyards, and archaeological sites, changing not the past itself, but who is allowed to appear within it. The document survived unevenly too. Congress printed its declaration on durable sheets. An enslaved woman's words may remain only as a sentence written by the man who owned her. A native speech may survive through an interpreter and secretary with political motives. A poor soldier's experience may appear through an officer's complaint about dirty tents. Recovering hidden life requires reading power's records for the people power tried to reduce to categories. By late December, those hidden people were carrying the revolution through its darkest season. Women mended clothing beside uncertain fires. Farmers watched armed strangers use fence rails for fuel. Enslaved families assessed rumours from both camps. New Jersey residents hid property or declared loyalty under pressure. Soldiers along the Delaware shivered through night watches. The abstract nation existed because physical bodies continued to work for it, flee from it, resist it, or endure its arrival. Washington planned an attack because time had become more dangerous than the enemy. Many enlistments would expire with the year. If men departed without a victory, recruiting might collapse. British and Hessian forces occupied a chain of New Jersey posts, and the garrison at Trenton appeared vulnerable. The plan called for multiple American columns to cross the ice-filled Delaware on Christmas night and converge before dawn on December 26th. The weather turned vicious. Cold rain, sleet, snow, and wind struck men already poorly clothed. The river carried floating ice. Boats designed to haul iron ore and farm goods became military transports. Experienced watermen guided them through darkness as artillery, horses, soldiers, and equipment moved from Pennsylvania to the New Jersey shore. The crossing took longer than planned. Other American columns failed to cross or could not participate as intended. Washington's force stood alone. The familiar painting of Washington crossing the Delaware captures determination, but invents much of the visible scene. The flag shown belonged to a later design. The boat is too small for the depicted group. Washington probably did not stand dramatically in a fragile craft amid ice. Real courage needed no theatrical posture. It existed in cold hands gripping wet oars, in horses trembling on crowded ferries, and in soldiers stepping onto a dark bank without knowing whether their powder would remain dry. The march to Trenton continued through the storm. Men left bloody tracks where shoes had failed. Officers struggled to keep units together. Weapons had to be protected from moisture. The force divided into columns under Washington and Nathaniel Greene on one route, and John Sullivan on another, approaching the town from different directions. Surprise remained possible, partly because the weather that tortured the attackers also concealed them. The Hessian garrison under Colonel Johann Rall had received warnings of danger, but alerts had become frequent, and American capacity seemed weak. The popular story that the Hessians were helplessly drunk after Christmas celebration is misleading. They were tired, exposed, and surprised, not defeated by a holiday caricature. Soldiers had been on alert and skirmishing in an occupied region. Rall's command suffered from imperfect defences, incomplete intelligence, and the speed of the American attack. Shortly after 8 in the morning, American forces entered Trenton. Artillery commanded by Henry Knox fired down streets. Units blocked escape routes. Fighting moved through snow, houses, orchards, and open ground. Rall was mortally wounded. After a short battle, roughly 900 Hessian soldiers were captured, while others escaped. American combat losses were remarkably light, though men suffered from exposure, and 2 reportedly froze to death during the operation. The victory was small compared with the enormous armies Britain had deployed, but scale was not its meaning. Washington had carried a force across an ice-filled river, attacked trained troops, taken prisoners, captured supplies, and returned. Newspapers could print a victory instead of another retreat. Recruits could imagine the cause surviving. Foreign observers could reconsider. A nation living on confidence had received a deposit. For the captured Hessians, the morning meant shock, injury, humiliation, and a march into captivity. Crowds stared at uniforms they had learned to fear. Some Americans were surprised that the supposedly monstrous foreigners looked like ordinary exhausted men. Prisoners would be moved through communities, put to labour, exchanged, or held for long periods. Some eventually chose to remain in America. The enemy and propaganda became a neighbour in peace. For Trenton's residents, liberation and battle occupied the same streets. Homes became firing positions, shelters, or damaged property. Civilians hid in cellars. Loyalists feared retaliation. Patriot families emerged cautiously. The battle later became a clean arrow on a campaign map, but residents experienced noise, broken glass, wounded strangers, confiscated supplies, and uncertainty about which army would return next. Washington's army crossed back into Pennsylvania with prisoners and captured material, then returned to New Jersey. A second crisis at Trenton in early January 1777, and the victory at Princeton would continue the reversal, but those events belonged to the year ahead. The calendar closed after Trenton with independence still alive, not secured. No one on December 31st could see the final shape of the war. France had not yet entered as an open ally. The British still held New York and possessed overwhelming naval strength. Congress struggled for money and authority. State governments were new. The Continental Army needed recruitment, supply, discipline, and reform. Smallpox threatened. Loyalism remained powerful. Native nations were choosing strategies that would reshape their communities. Enslaved people were moving toward uncertain opportunities, while slaveholders defended the institution. The famous year therefore ended without resolution. Its emotional arc appears complete only because later generations know Yorktown, the peace treaty, the Constitution, and the expansion of the United States.
The people of 1776 possessed no such map. They had declarations, rumours, losses, promises, debts, scars, and winter. For a soldier, the future might be measured by the days remaining on an enlistment. For an enslaved mother, by the distance to British lines and whether children could travel. For a Loyalist merchant, by the number of goods that could be hidden before a committee arrived. For a Cherokee family, by the corn remaining after militia burned a town. For a farmer, by the condition of a horse. For a widow, by whether a court recognized an account. Great political uncertainty entered life through immediate calculations. This is why 1776 cannot be understood only through the men assembled in Philadelphia. Their work mattered profoundly. The Declaration changed the political imagination of the world. But the world of the Declaration included everyone whose labour made the meeting possible, and everyone its first application ignored.
The mahogany desk connected to Atlantic slavery. The linen shirt washed by a woman without a vote. The meal cooked by an enslaved servant. The paper made from worn cloth. The building heated by wood cut and hauled by unseen hands. Even the room of liberty rested on dependence. The founding generation understood some of its contradictions and avoided others. Anti-slavery voices existed. Enslaved petitioners spoke. Women challenged male authority. Native diplomats explained sovereignty. Poor farmers demanded broader participation. These were not modern ideas mysteriously transported backward. They were arguments present in the revolutionary world. Later Americans cannot excuse every exclusion by claiming no one knew another possibility. Nor can the revolution be dismissed as nothing more than hypocrisy. Men and women accepted real danger for self-government. Political institutions were created under wartime pressure. Ordinary people learned to act through committees, elections, petitions, boycotts, associations, and military service. Hereditary monarchy lost legitimacy across a vast territory. Religious establishments weakened. Ideas of popular sovereignty expanded. Slavery faced new ideological attack in northern states and beyond, even as it remained strong and later expanded elsewhere. The truth lies in the tension. A hypocritical ideal can still be an ideal. A limited revolution can still transform the world. The Declaration did not free everyone, but its language refused to stay owned by its signers. Abolitionists would cite it. Women's rights advocates would echo its structure. Workers, immigrants, civil rights activists, and people resisting colonial rule across the world
would adapt its claims. Each movement forced the nation to hear words it had celebrated without fully obeying. The legacy also includes expansion and violence. Independence removed imperial restraints on Western settlement and empowered governments determined to acquire indigenous land. Treaties were pressured, manipulated, violated, or interpreted to favour the United States. Warfare destroyed communities. Removal followed in later generations. The Republic's geographic growth, often narrated as destiny, was experienced by native peoples as invasion, backed by a government born from resistance to distant rule. Slavery survived the Revolution and became more deeply connected to American economic development. Northern gradual emancipation did not produce immediate equality. The Constitution later protected slaveholding power through compromise. Cotton expansion would drive forced migration and family separation on a vast scale. The republic that declared natural rights required a civil war nearly a century later to abolish legal slavery, and racial domination continued through new forms. Women's political exclusion also survived, even as their revolutionary labour encouraged the ideal later called Republican motherhood, which valued women as educators of virtuous citizens while keeping formal power male. Some women used education and civic influence to widen their roles. Others rejected the boundary itself. The request to remember the ladies remained unanswered in law for generations, but it had entered the record where it could not be forgotten. Religious liberty developed through state and federal change, producing one of the Revolution's most durable achievements. Yet pluralism remained contested. Catholics, Jews, dissenting Protestants, non-believers and others continued to face barriers and prejudice. Freedom of conscience expanded because minority communities insisted that toleration granted by a majority was less secure than a right no government should control. Democracy likewise emerged through conflict rather than gift. Property requirements weakened over time for white men. Political parties mobilized voters despite founders' suspicion of faction. Free black men lost voting rights in some places, even as white male suffrage widened. Women gained and lost voting access in early New Jersey before national suffrage came much later. Every expansion created new arguments over the definition of the people. The material remains of colonial America still surround modern life, though they are easy to miss. Road patterns follow old paths. City blocks preserve colonial boundaries beneath towers. Courthouses occupy squares where declarations were read. Churches stand over earlier foundations. Family names remain attached to towns, universities, and institutions, sometimes honouring wealth created by slavery or dispossession. Recipes, words, crops, crafts, legal concepts, and political rituals carry fragments of 1776 forward. At preserved battlefields, the land can appear peaceful enough to resist imagination. Grass covers the places where men fell. Highways cross retreat routes. Houses stand where orchards and redoubts once shaped decisions. The work of history is to restore the uncertainty. Participants did not know which side would win, which comrade would survive, or which remembered story would become national truth. At Independence Hall, visitors now pass through controlled rooms and look toward the chamber where delegates debated. The furniture appears still. The air is cleaner. No carts interrupt discussion. No summer insects enter open windows. The silence creates reverence, but it can also remove the building from life. In 1776, it was surrounded by markets, workshops, horses, rented rooms, labour, waste, gossip, prayer, fear, and contradiction. The Declaration did not emerge outside that world. It emerged from within it. At plantations preserved as historic sites, interpretation now increasingly names enslaved residents rather than describing them only as labour. Archaeology locates quarters, kitchens, burial grounds, gardens, and personal objects. Descendant communities ask different questions from owners' account books. Who cooked here? Who raised these children? Who escaped? Who was sold? What did they call one another when the master was absent? Each recovered name alters the scale of the founding story.
Indigenous historic sites demand another change of viewpoint. A colonial fort is also an intrusion into native country. A frontier victory can be the destruction of a town. A land deed can be evidence of diplomatic misunderstanding or coercion. Maps that begin with 13 colonies erase the political geography already occupying the page. Restoring native nations does not add a side note to American history. It redraws the center. Even ordinary household objects become witnesses when viewed honestly. A porcelain cup speaks of trade, fashion, women's work, imperial taxation, and perhaps enslaved sugar.
A musket speaks of craftsmanship, hunting, militia duty, war, and state power. A spinning wheel speaks of repetitive labour and patriotic symbolism. A pair of iron shackles speaks without metaphor. No single object tells the whole truth, but together they prevent the past from becoming a slogan. The myths surrounding 1776 often make its people either marble heroes or uniquely cruel strangers. They were human beings, operating within systems they inherited, defended, challenged, and changed. They could love their children and participate in dispossession. They could speak beautifully about liberty and hold people in bondage. They could risk death for neighbours and persecute dissenters. Recognizing contradiction is not an attack on history. It is the beginning of understanding it. Their physical courage also deserves a human scale. Crossing an icy river is more impressive when the men are allowed to be cold and afraid.
Signing a declaration is more meaningful when failure could destroy families and careers. Escaping slavery is more courageous when freedom is not guaranteed at the destination. Defending a native town is more urgent when generations of memory occupy the ground. Managing a farm alone is more consequential when money is failing and armies are approaching. The year produced no single American experience. A wealthy patriot planter could call it the birth of freedom. An enslaved worker on his estate could call it an opportunity not yet fulfilled. A New York Loyalist could call it the destruction of home. A Hessian prisoner could call it the beginning of exile. A Cherokee mother could remember smoke rising from cornfields. A Philadelphia artisan could remember bells. All were true, and none was complete alone. Today, the words of the Declaration are often quoted as if their meaning was self-evident. In 1776, they were revolutionary precisely because they were not.
Equality challenged inherited rank. Rights placed a limit on government. Consent made rulers answerable to the ruled. But the document left unanswered who counted as equal, whose rights received protection, and whose consent mattered. American history has unfolded inside those unanswered questions. Every generation inherits both the promise and the exclusions. The easiest form of patriotism memorizes the promise and forgets the cost. The easiest form of cynicism remembers the hypocrisy and dismisses the promise. History asks more. It asks us to hold the Declaration beside the runaway advertisement, the voting rule beside the woman's account book, the victory report beside the burned native town, and the general's order beside the soldier's bloody footprint. When these pieces are placed together, colonial America becomes less comfortable and more alive. We see a society connected to the world, not isolated from it. We see households as engines of labour, not decorative backgrounds. We see enslaved and indigenous people as political actors, not silent victims. We see loyalists as participants in a civil conflict, not shadows outside the nation. We see women sustaining public revolution through work classified as private. We see ordinary people making choices under pressures no commemorative painting can fully contain. Return, then, to the darkness before sunrise. The woman in Pennsylvania lifts a flame from buried embers. The enslaved workers in Virginia move toward another day of labour, while rumours of liberty travel between plantations. A Boston watchman calls the hour in a town the British have left. A New York family sleeps in exile. A Cherokee survivor looks across the remains of a burned settlement. Along the Delaware, A soldier wakes with wet wool against his skin and does not yet know whether he will remain when his enlistment ends. Nothing about their future is certain. The Republic might fail. The army might disappear.
A promise of freedom might become capture. A family might be separated by sale or allegiance. A treaty might become another path to invasion. Yet people continue to act. They write, row, plant, hide, petition, march, nurse, trade, pray, escape, and remember. That is the untold truth about colonial America in 1776. Independence was not born in one room, on one date, from one sentence. It emerged through millions of lives moving at different speeds toward different hopes. It was carried by hands that signed documents and hands that could not legally own the paper. It announced universal rights within a world of unequal power. It opened a future no one could control. The distance between the ideal and the reality is not empty space. It is where American history happened. It is where people excluded from the first definition of the nation forced that definition to widen. It is where the past still reaches into the present, asking whether liberty is a possession inherited from 1776 or a responsibility that each generation must make more honest. The bells have long stopped ringing. The smoke has cleared from the fields and cities. The boats that crossed the Delaware are gone. But the question carried through that winter remains: who belongs inside the promise? The answer was unfinished then. It is unfinished now.